The bright sunlight penetrates through the glass windows, filling the bouquet of hydrangeas with warmth. The lady's dress rustles on the hallway tiles, clearly surprised by the interlocutor's words. She is trying to accept the information received, so she instinctively asks again. Adelia Gerard, daughter of the Margrave of the country of Earls, cries and cannot believe what she heard. Repeating her question again. When the interlocutor apologizes and says that Count Gerard no longer exists, she mechanically slaps him on the cheek. The girl furiously bombards the young man with questions, reminding him that only thanks to the Count, the dark-haired young man. Servan, a war hero from the country of Elaine, is alive and free. He apologizes again for what he is about to receive another slap. However, this time the young man takes Adelia's hand and looks calmly into her eyes. Servan apologizes again as the girl bursts into tears and screams. She withdraws her hand and says it would be better if her father had never helped and freed the hero of the country of Elaine. The young heiress of the country, Earls, even tries to blame herself for her father's death. But Servan interrupts her and reminds her that he himself did it. Servan says he decapitated Count Gerard with his own hands and then handed over his body to his compatriots while placing his hand on the girl's shoulder. She abruptly moves away from him again, screaming. Adelia sees the face of the young man in front of her. He is calm and determined. The sun plays with the gold trim of his uniform. He is determined to see it through to the end. However, a sudden declaration of love from a girl takes away his seriousness. And Servan catches his breath. He approaches Adelia and tries to take her hand gently. She frees herself again and screams that she loved him, that the calluses on his hands resonated with pain in her heart, and that his wounds tore her apart. And now she sees these hands of her father's murderer, the hands of a traitor who desecrated his homeland, and trampled on her heart. Servan is confused, and the mark from the slap no longer hurts as much as the words that hurt the soul. Adelia looks at him with hatred and disappointment, and tears still run down her cheeks. The pink-haired girl continues screaming, mixing the bitterness of tears with the rage of loss. Servan hears words that she will never love him again. Adelia flees crying, leaving the confused young man alone with the memories of these strong words. He cares for her and wants to say something. However, the only thing he can throw at her is another very silent apology. It is getting dark, and the young man is in the street, leaning against the carved wall of the palace. He looks silently into the distance as tears run down his cheeks. Powerless, Servan slides down the wall, closes his eyes, and sighs deeply. He could never tell her the terrible truth that his father was killed by his own compatriots. The crowd carried the Margrave's head, impaled on a cross, calling him a traitor to his homeland, hoping that he would be thrown to the dogs. The dark-haired young man heard these same people say unpleasant things about Adelia's father, even after his death. And the culprit is actually Alcarian Aeolic, the prince of the country of Aeolic, the young woman's fiancé. Adelia's father died because of the crime the prince framed him for. But the poor girl certainly believed her fiancé. She was deprived of her freedom, but still believed her father and her fiancé. She is trying with all her might not to collapse, not to lose hope. It's over. Servan cannot tell her the truth. Thus arose a fatal misunderstanding between Adelia and Servan, and many bitter days passed before the girl finally learned the truth. Unfortunately, this happened after Servan drank the potion. A terrible disaster has occurred. The castle is on fire, and a girl's crying can be heard inside. Adelia sits next to the bloody Servan, apologizing incessantly and begging him to get up. Her face floods with tears. The fire shines around them, and the dying man addresses his beloved with his last request. And the request is quite simple, which surprises the girl, because Servan only wants to call her by her name. The princess bursts into tears and cannot believe that she did not trust her protector. His eyes barely radiate life, and he still calls her by her name, declaring his love. She hugs his head, talks about love, and begs him on no account to die or leave her. Unfortunately, he cannot promise that, so he makes his last efforts to call William. In the heat of the fire, a blonde young man appears who tries to carry the girl away, although she resists. William literally has to drag Adelia, warning her of the danger. On Van's face appear his own tears or those of his beloved, to whom he directs his last look, asking her not to cry for him. And to be happy. She tries to run to him again, but collapses exhausted. William remains calm and skillfully supports the girl. From the fire, the voice of Sir Van is heard addressing the blonde young man, asking him only to take care of the princess. A smile freezes on Van's face, because until the last moment, he was happy just because he had seen her. In the shining hand, the sword lights up with rage and knocks down the stone slabs of the castle. With the colors of fire and the noise of collapsing stone, Sir Van says goodbye to Ada for the last time. And he saved the last member of the Gerard family. The people of Earls hated Adelia's father, Gerard, so they came and burned the castle. Adelia Gerard fled to the country of Elaine. Sir Van made sure beforehand that she had a place to spend the night that night. A pink-haired girl lies on a bed made in a shack abandoned by the hand of God. Half asleep, she cries and curses Elcarion, promising to overthrow him from the throne at any cost. But above all, her thoughts and feelings are occupied by longing for her beloved and forever lost Van. Adelia Gerard did not suspect that it was then that the wheel of destiny began to turn. The first rays of the sun gently illuminate a haystack. Passing through a small window in the roof, they greet the beautiful sleeper. Adelia, lying on a haystack, slowly wakes up from her sleep, surprised at how much her body hurts. She suddenly opens her eyes, gets up, and looks around in horror. She is surprised to be in some kind of wooden hanger and sleeping on a pile of hay. Next to the girl is an unusual pink object with a pattern on the lid. It looks like an ointment. Adelia grabbed it and began to examine it. It seemed to remind her of something. Suddenly, a voice in the street asks Sir Van if he has seen my lady, which greatly disconcerts my lady. She gets up and approaches the wooden door to look through the crack and see what is happening outside. The young man has his back to the hanger, holds a bag in his hands, and asks his interlocutor if he has lost his lady. He nods and says with a kind smile that this happens often, revealing the tattoo on his neck. Adelia has no doubts. She is shocked to see her Van Juan again. Here he is, talking to the maid as if nothing happened, although she died. The interlocutor, clearly no longer worried about the princess's disappearance, flirts with Van and invites him to spend the evening together, which she refuses. Disappointed, she turns away and leaves quickly, muttering something under her breath about the incorrigibility of men. Meanwhile, Adelia keeps watching what is happening behind the ajar door and thinks that everything is a dream. The situation reminds her of the past, and now she goes out to the bewildered young man, remembering how things were before. At that time, she was constantly angry with him for chatting with that maid who brought him fruit out of spite. The princess sent Sir Van to the forest to look for fences instead of boring fruit, because she was jealous. He was a slave at that time and barely had time to sleep. Therefore, Adelia did not expect the young man to still venture into the forest where there were monsters. The hands in which he held fruit and fences were disfigured by scars and calluses. Sir Van had to work hard to overcome the pain, and she looked at him and only thought about the status gap between them. One day, Milady regretted it and wanted to apologize for her capricious mischief. So she left the estate and started looking for Sir Van and entered his room. It smelled of hay, so Van himself smells the same. She lay down on a haystack and realized how bitterly she regretted her actions towards the young man. Clutching a bottle of healing ointment in her hands and dreaming that she would apologize properly now, she fell asleep. However, the memory of the scene of flirting with the maid only awoke jealousy in her. So, instead of apologizing, Adelia said unpleasant things to Sir Van and hit him. At that time, the girl had just married the prince and tried to be glad she wasn't marrying Sir Van. She denied her feelings for him and thought that falling in love with a slave humiliated her dignity as the daughter of a margrave. And when she finally realized her love, he died. Milady took Sir Van by surprise with her appearance. He was very surprised to find her in his room. She still held the flask from a story in her hands and looked at him with eyes full of hope. Unable to bear such emotional shock, she burst into tears. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and finally she could only ask for forgiveness. Not understanding anything, Servan began to urgently examine his lady and asked if she felt pain. She wiped away her tears, but the young man did not know what to do because he saw the princess's tears for the first time. Servan rubbed her cheek with his palm and asked again if Adelia was hurt. And she replied that she was unfair and that she had come to heal his hands. Meanwhile, she realizes that Van's hands are very warm. And then a thought struck her. Stopping even her tears, she moved away from him, giving space to that thought. To fully grasp what was happening, she turned around and walked towards the haystack, reflecting on how it was possible to feel real warmth, as in reality. Feeling crazy, she lay down on the hay and noticed that, despite the hardness, it was pleasant to lie on it. Already bewildered by my lady's behavior, Servan was also surprised by her question about why he remained still. Radiant with mixed feelings and thoughts, she looked at him tenderly and called him. The surprised young man did not dare to move, so she called again. Adelia was so beautiful and unusual in her behavior that he began to sweat from emotion. Exhausted, he simply fell to his knees next to her, wondering if this was a dream, to which he received the answer that there was no difference. Ada looked at him with the most admiring gaze, noting aloud the young man's age as he turned away embarrassed, and closed his eyes. When Servan finally dared to look at my lady, she was bewildered. Adelia wondered aloud why she saw the young man in front of her, because she had just been sleeping. And suddenly he was here. Leaning on the palm of her hand, she affectionately noted that she was very happy to see Servan now. If it weren't for something. She touched his injured hand again and said that the feeling of warmth still scared her. So they sat, holding hands, him on his knees on the floor and her on a haystack. Adelia looked again at the scars on Van's arm. This confused the young man again, who tried to find an explanation for my lady's unusual behavior. Then he looked at her and asked if perhaps she had drunk wine today. After all, if my lady is not feeling well, Servan can immediately call a doctor. Only she must let go of his hand. Ada thought that even in her dream, the young man was just as affectionate, and then decided that in this dream, she had to do everything she didn't have time to do in reality. Still bewildered, Servan watched as Adelia turned towards the precious pink flask. With tenderness, she began to rub the contents onto the hands of a man who lived by hard work. Bowing her head, the girl said that she still regretted sending the young man to the forest, and asked him why he had gone there. These conversations and actions raised more questions than they answered for the dark-haired Servan. Meanwhile, tears rolled down Adelia's cheeks again. She squeezed his hand with both hands. With eyes full of tears, she looked at him and asked for forgiveness for screaming. And at that moment, the room was filled with violet light, which was emitted by the closed palms of the young people. An inexplicable glow was created by a bracelet made of stones on the girl's left hand. She looked at what was happening with genuine surprise and tried to find an explanation for it. Servan was a Selagilian, a nomadic people from the north. They are distinguished by their physical strength and endurance, but weak in magic. They could not use magic crystals and were therefore a minority in the Earl's empire. Their culture was considered backward, and they were often forced into slavery. The Imperials often joked about the Selagilians, saying that if these people had even a drop of magic, they would be invincible. Servan is exactly like that. He was a gladiator slave and was used in Colosseum battles until his father took pity on him and took him out of slavery. Unlike all Selagilians, Servan was born with strong magical abilities. In one sense, he was a heretic, although in another sense he could be called a genius. When a magic bracelet comes into contact with a person, it only reacts when it is a stronger mage. Adelia definitely refrains from using magic, which means that these are Servan's powers. She was amazed and exclaimed how it was possible for the bracelet to react to the young man since when. From his contained emotions and total lack of surprise, she realized that Servan knew about his strength. He withdrew his hand and said that it was not dangerous for my lady, and this was not at all what she might have thought. Van tried to distance himself further from Adelia and raised his hands to show his safety, while saying that it was the first time he had touched first-class crystals. But he definitely did nothing because he could not control it. The girl clearly did not expect any harm from the young man. She was only surprised that the bracelet shone when it came into contact with him. She still wondered how the stones could react to Servan, since he was a Celagelian, while his face showed only slight consideration. Adelia was also surprised by Van's lack of surprise. This first-degree crystal bracelet reacts to a superior force. And this is the first time he has never met such a strong mage. She is still trying to understand the situation and asks how long Servan has known about magic in himself. He put his hands on his knees and began by saying that even with his origins, before becoming a slave, he had seen several magic crystals. This revelation surprised Adelia, because if he knows everything, why didn't he run away? Why would he be a slave if he possesses magic? The conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise from outside. The young people went to the door of the room, and a knock was heard on the wooden surface. They froze, anticipating the inevitable. The door opened, thanks to a simple push from outside. A young man with green eyes entered the room and began to call Servan. In the haystack, Servan leaned over Adelia. He kept his hand on the girl's bracelet, while the uninvited guest was surprised that no one was in the room. Van approached Milady and whispered in her ear that she could punish him later. She looked at him and blushed with shame. What was happening seemed unreal. The young people were under a luminous violet dome. Servan was confident and calm, and Adelia was prepared to know that they were about to be discovered. Two young men in white shirts stood perplexed in the middle of the room, wondering where Van could have gone. The sound of footsteps approaching the lovers' shelter was chilling. Even Servan became cautious, while Adelia was ready to scream. Mentally, she was already screaming in horror. The guests looked around a bit more, bewildered by where their friend had gone. One of them looked directly at the violet magic sphere, but saw absolutely nothing. The door slammed shut, and the guests left the empty house. Adelia let out a sigh of relief. Now the color rose to her face from shame at such physical proximity, and Servan apologized moderately. Thoughts swirled in the princess's head about what had happened, whether it was a dream or reality. She looked at him again, very calm but a little bewildered. There was an awkward pause, during which they simply looked into each other's eyes. Servan honestly promised that he would never leave or betray my lady. He will not use magic or crystals because he likes being here. Adelia couldn't believe what she was hearing with such abilities. Van only asks not to be kicked out. She kept trying to grasp reality, and a brilliant idea came to her. She should simply ask Van to hit her hard. The young man was quite bewildered by this comment. Milady quickly remembered whom she was dealing with and realized that she would have to act herself. Looking in horror, Servan grabbed her hand, while Adelia noticed that the pain was real. He took her hand, apologized, and asked if everything was all right with my lady. His words of apology resonated in the princess's memory. She used to be constantly angry with Van for his endless apologies. And now she looks at him with completely different eyes, and every word that comes out of his mouth makes her heart beat faster. She froze at the mere possibility of contemplating him as he was. They looked at each other, and the warm rays of the summer sun came through the window, completely real. And it seemed that this was not a dream. Pink peonies on the nightstand of a richly decorated bedroom catch the first rays of the sun. A pink-haired girl lies on the bed on soft pillows. Her thoughts are heavy because every new day brings memories of the lost meaning of life. She lost her dearest ones. Her father and Servan died poisoned by Gabin's poison, whose death is painful and unbearable. These two most important men in her life drank poison and died. And it was the prince's doing. From time to time, images representing her wonderful father appear in her memory. He was strict in appearance, but behind his severity hid a kind heart. They rarely saw each other. He was busy with the duties of defending the homeland. However, she knew of his unconditional love for his daughter. The prince framed Adelia's father. She hates the one who handed over the throne to the prince. Here, her family's troubles began, and this hatred helps her move forward. And not despair. The princess realizes that she has returned to the past, where, fortunately, her father is still alive. But is this really true? How is it possible to travel back in time for real? Ada sits on the bed, looks at her hands, and realizes that she cannot run away from reality. After all, even if it is a dream, she is obliged to make it come true. The lady promises herself to change everything and not let anything bad happen. Servan is good at magic, but he still has to learn and learn before handling magic crystals. It is unknown how strong he is in magic, but we need to help him escape. But the girl also does not want to be separated for a full 4 years. Less than a month remains, and we need to help the talented Celagelian become stronger. The truly strong usually do not show their strength, but Ada still cannot understand why he does not want to escape. Now she looks more closely at the young man's portrait. He always protected my lady. His family loves him. What family? Everyone loves him. The girl sighs and realizes that it is time to completely get out of bed. Being alone, she could finally sort out her thoughts. How strange that the chubby cheeks are still there, although the princess was haggard before her return. Here she is 19 again, and knows that she needs to become the winner of this endless war. Even if she lives until she is 23 and nothing works out, she will just go back. The Gerard clan has always defended their homeland earlies, but since they will still be betrayed, it is necessary to get ahead of the enemies and be the first to betray him. Elcarian's smile still comes to mind. Well then, Adelia is determined to forever deprive her main enemy of luck. Several days passed, the weather was clear, a cool wind blew the leaves from the trees. The air smelled of regularity and the work of the laborers. The young people worked tirelessly. Among them, of course, is the thoughtful Servan looking at the castle walls. There is nothing to do, you have to go help the boys. A beautiful lady in a blue ruffled dress looks at him from the living room window. Her gaze is piercing. While drinking a cup of tea, she once again reflects on the life of her lover. A dark-haired young man with a blonde face, so strong and so lacking in freedom. The girl's hand trembled, causing the tea to sway back and forth in the delicate bowl. And historical images arose in her memory again. The millennial earless empire is strong due to its production of magic crystals. And there is another empire, Elaine. Many nationalities live in Elaine, and the country has an inevitable conflict with Earless over Sonya. A country bordering both and possessing first-class magic crystal mines. Earless and Elaine waged a war for dominance over the market for this valuable resource. And in this war, Servan became a hero not of Earls but of Elaine. He did it for the sake of my lady with her father. And the main objective of Earls, or rather even Prince Earls, is the Gerard family. Elcarian will stop at nothing to serve his interests. The only thing Adelia wants now is to cut off the murderer's head and rip out all his veins. The tea is almost finished. According to the plan, the princess needs to get up after midnight tonight. And she can sleep later. She left the dishes on the table, got up from the chair, and headed to the bedroom. The pink-haired woman looks at the made bed and reflects that her situation could be worse. She lies down thinking that today she will definitely succeed. Night fell, the waning moon appeared from behind the pink clouds. The rustling of dresses is heard among the bushes near the castle. Adelia, wearing a dark cloak, moves quickly and rapidly along the majestic columns. She breathes heavily and hopes that no one has noticed her presence. Suddenly, a violet sphere begins to shine around her. The moon hangs over the majestic castle. Silence and calm float in the air. A young man walks calmly through the Margrave's courtyard. Servan is thinking about Milady's unusual behavior lately and finds it strange. She used to constantly send him on errands, but for some reason, she stopped doing it now. And she also has a very strange look when he realizes it is not clear how it is possible. Because before, the princess only vented her anger on him. Are these thoughts still spinning in the young man's head? It seems he almost understood everything. When suddenly Servan heard a strange noise behind him, he instantly looked around to see what was happening. It was evident that someone was hiding among the bushes along the castle wall. The unknown man in the dark cloak clearly does not have good camouflage skills. He hid in such a way that even the blind would notice him. However, if you look closer at this strange stranger, it seems you can notice some important features. The pink hair under the hood clearly belongs to my lady. What a shame. Why is my lady hiding at this hour? Servan simply decided to pretend he noticed nothing because it was none of his business. The young man moved away from the noticeable bush, hid behind the wall, and took a deep breath. And he even felt a little embarrassed by the tenderness of what he saw. He looked back, and all that remained of the hidden pink-haired girl was a shining trace of the illusion spell. I wonder why she is using magic here and what she plans to do. A clear, starry sky hangs over the city. Some streets are immersed in peace and sleep. Meanwhile, our fugitive in a raincoat makes her way through other streets, as busy as day. Although it is summer now, it is terribly cold, and besides, my hair gets in the way and reaches my face. I need to look for hairpins at the market. Fortunately, on the nearest counter, there are colorful ribbons and hairpins that will help you put your hair in order. The girl had already moved towards the exit when she suddenly discovered something truly surprising. Servan was just around the corner, astonished to have been discovered, although he took no action to hide. He apologized to Milady as usual, saying that it was none of his business to watch over a high-ranking person, but that he was simply worried about her at such a late hour. However, Adelia was not worried about surveillance at all, but about the possible death of her lover. Servan warned that he carefully followed my lady so that no one would notice. But it seems his fears are elsewhere. The tattoo on Van's neck is not a tattoo at all, but a slave mark. Moreover, the mark is unusual but magical, and will explode if it moves too far from the owner. Or from the house. If he were to move away from my lady now, something terrible would happen. Of course, if Adelia had known that Servan would follow her, she would have deactivated the mark. It's strange that this thought hadn't occurred to her before. She reached for her neck to remove it now and let the young man go home. However, it turned out not to be so simple. He skillfully dodged her hand. At the same time, Van himself turned the girl with her back to him and removed her hood. When she asked him why he was doing this, the young man replied that he was going to braid the lady's hair. The girl froze and did not dare to resist, and Servan concentrated on the pink hair. Previously, he braided it every day, and the princess was still capricious. And she constantly asked for her hair to be redone. Now she is ashamed of her behavior, but she did it only to spend more time with Van. It had been a long time since Adelia felt his hands in her hair. His hands skillfully braided her hair, which made the girl wonder where the young man learned this art. It turned out that Van had a younger sister who was restless and constantly had a mess on her head. So he braided her hair. Ada was embarrassed and said that she didn't know anything about Servan's sister, that she didn't know where she was now. And if she was alive. Seligilians in the Earl's Empire have a very difficult life, but despite this, Servan continues to protect his lady, perhaps because she reminds him of his sister. Despite the touching nature of the moment, Adelia has no right to cry now. The young man finished combing her hair and put the hood back on the princess's head, reminding her that she had a very important matter to attend to, and then decided to show the stone shining in his palm. Adelia was truly astonished, because this is a grade 6 crystal. He really bought it with his meager slave salary. This was followed by the question of why Servan showed her the crystal, to which the young man replied that the crystal increases his precision and strength. Count Gerard taught him something, and now he wants to help Milady with magic. Adelia was amazed that all this time, Van had such a stone with him. Even within one Raclay stone, it is impossible for her to imitate the magic of the Gerards. But here there is only 6. He was just lucky that nothing happened to him, and even Servan admits it himself. So he decides to give the stone to my lady. Ada looks at the shining crystal and cannot stop thinking about the stigma, which could bring many more problems. Thus she gains strength to do something that her interlocutor may not like. With her palms, the princess creates a beam of magical light around the Seligilian's palm. Thus, a bracelet with purple stones carved in gold appears on his hand. Such an expensive jewel clearly confuses a simple slave, because people might notice it. And it would look strange, although my lady insists that Van should not take off the bracelet. Immediately, another problem arises. How will my lady manage without a magic bracelet herself? To which she calmly informs that she will buy a new one, while even her bow has a similar stone. Servan has no choice but to accept an expensive gift from his lady. With the most naive look, he looks at her and tells her that he will wear the bracelet for her. Adelia has pending matters, so she makes another attempt to remove the mark from her slave. She even has to stand on her tiptoes to catch Van, who dodges. He does not agree to the removal of the mark in any way. Reflecting on the current situation, he offers an alternative scenario. Van asks permission to go on a trip with Milady. They wandered through a not-so-prosperous part of the city, not a soul on the street, dirt. And strange boxes everywhere. Of the pleasant human bustle, not a trace remains. The lantern sputters furiously. Servan looks around suspiciously and asks why Milady needed to go to that place alone. Adelia moves confidently and states that she has been preparing for this event. Although Van reminds her that he can carry out any of her instructions himself. The princess says she came here for a meeting, to which she again receives a clarifying question, which makes her start to feel that Sebin is scolding her a little. A bright purple dome forms around her again. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it doesn't turn out to be the most beautiful and uniform. On the other hand, the less competent she seems, the more brazen her future interlocutors will be. But Van admires such skills. The young man again wants to offer his help to my lady if she gets tired, when suddenly a crash is heard in the street. Curses and pursuit are heard in the distance. The girl is surprised, and the young man becomes cautious, prepared for anything, and protects my lady with himself. A middle-aged, dark-haired man stopped and shouted to try to stop the fugitive. Someone grabbed the red-haired boy by the hair, accusing him of fleeing like a slave. The boy tries to resist and shouts that he is not a slave but an Erlishan, which bewilders Ada, who is watching what is happening. The red-haired boy is still being handled by a strong hand, noting that the boy is not marked. But the princess seems to be starting to recognize him. Suddenly, a large, familiar palm appears in front of her face. Servan carefully covers my lady's face so that she does not have to look at the horror that is happening. However, the girl pushes away her defender's palm, saying that she needs this red-haired boy, and that he must help him. The intercessor clearly does not understand why the princess needed this rogue. Adelia is confused by this question and says that her fate depends on this boy. She exhales deeply and realizes that it is time to prepare for battle. The heiress of the Gerard family concentrates all her powers on the magic crystal she wears in a ribbon around her neck. The stone fills with energy and illuminates everything around her. The bright glow and sparks attract the attention of the pursuers. They look around in horror and realize that in front of them is Aya. There are not so many mages in the world, but among them there are very few battle mages. That is why in the ancient dialect they are called few. That is, and Adelia belongs to these mages. As a noble lady, she has the right to punish those who oppress and steal from the people. That is why a radiance appears over the thieves, falling like whips on their backs. It seems that the result exceeded expectations, even Aya's own. Perhaps at 19, she already had such a clear track record. Or the reason for the exact actions lies elsewhere. Perhaps the reason lies with the faithful close assistant who is interested in which of the characters he should have. First, you need to gather the pursuers scattered on the sidewalk and hand them over to the guards. The frightened red-haired young man needs to be escorted home. The prepared lady even carried a rope with her. Servan was even more surprised that the boy needed to be taken home. Adelia realized that she had not expressed herself completely exactly and did not mean her own home. But this particular boy. Now the faithful knight learned all the details of the task and asked my lady to wait here for him while he did everything himself. In the street, there were pieces of stones and broken parts of wooden structures. The three pursuers were sitting on the cold stone pavement, tied up like dried fish. Now that it was about the injured green-eyed young man, Servan asked if he should also be tied up. The guy looked up at him, so Servan looked like a large and formidable man. The moonlight played whimsically with his yellow eyes, making him look like a supernatural creature in whose hands the red-haired boy's life now rested. He looked at the formidable enemy with eyes full of horror. The boy tried to back away, but there was already a wall there. At that moment, the knight's gaze slid towards the direction from where a strange sound was heard. There was a strange movement in the group of fish thieves. One of the attackers was carrying a knife, with which he desperately tried to cut the ties restraining his movements. Servan watched his actions without showing it. Adelia noticed Van's strange and intense gaze and called him. He immediately turned towards my lady, with eyes full of helpfulness. At that moment, one of the thieves burst into screams. He ran directly towards Milady Servan, who was worried about his state. Ada saw what was happening and screamed in horror to warn the young man of the danger. However, the dexterous Seligilian did not need warnings. He had excellent control of the situation. So he easily neutralized the attacker. This performance became a lesson for the entire associated trio of criminals. Adelia, astonished by how suddenly it happened, ran to her knight. She gently took his face to look at him more closely. He had a scratch on his face, which frightened the princess, although Servan assured her there was no cause for concern. But he sincerely asked her not to put herself in danger anymore. Soft fingers slid across the injured cheek, causing the young man to hold his breath with emotion. His eyes filled with surprise, mixed with the tenderest feelings. Servan smiled and could only agree with her request. He remained bent over my lady while she healed the scar on his cheek. Despite all the excitement of the moment, a strange noise made her suspicious and brought her back to reality. Adelia also heard a deep sigh coming from behind. It was the exhausted red-haired young man who groaned, doubling over in pain. The princess smiled. She finally caught the man. She caught the man who stole her luck. With a floating step, the princess approached the boy and offered him her hand. Her face expressed strange joy with cunning kindness. Passers-by still wandered the city streets in the light of the street lamps and dispersed to their homes. In the hospital, the injured young man, with his wounds covered in plaster, slept in a semi-delirious state. Maids rushed around him with various medicines. Adelia regretted not being able to communicate with the person she was looking for today. He fainted when she tried to call him with her, but she wanted him to remember her face and consider her his benefactor. Despite his fragile appearance, the red-haired young man is an excellent blacksmith. Everyone is jealous of his skill. If he fell into slavery, then he belongs only to Alcarion. However, the princess was craftier and stole the craftsman. Walking through the night streets of the city, Adelia invited Servan to ask all questions without hesitation. And he, of course, asked why my lady needed a blacksmith. She did not answer directly, but decided to tease her interlocutor, asking if he himself would like to be a blacksmith for her, which embarrassed the young man. Van is devoted to his lady like no other, and would accept any of her requests. Servan could have been a good blacksmith, but they reject this option. Adelia imagined her knight as a blacksmith, but this does not suit him at all. Because he should be a warrior. Memories of the last minutes of her lover's life returned to her mind, when she begged him not to die. Therefore, she seriously asked Servan to live, and under no circumstances to die, which bewildered the young man. In an even more serious tone, she made him promise not to die. In the same serious tone, he made this promise to her. It truly wasn't that hard to give it to him, because his whole life belongs to her. By my lady's word, he lives and for her he will die. His life and death are entirely in the princess's hands. Now the girl changed the subject, and jokingly noted that actually not only she needed the blacksmith, but him too. This comment surprised the young man. He asked if she really needed him, and Adelia just repeated her words with a malicious smile. When the blacksmith regains consciousness, she will order him to forge a sword and insert a crystal at the top of the hilt. Servan reminded Milady that he is a simple slave and does not need a sword with a magic stone. Adelia stopped the conversation about slavery, convincing her interlocutor that they both definitely needed the sword. They were in the greenhouse, and Van kept doubting the accuracy of Adelia's choice. Milady accepted no objections, arguing that it was not his place to wield a magic sword in the future. Servan noticed again, embarrassed, that he was a slave with a princess's mark on his neck. The daughter of the Margrave remembered that she could remove the mark now, and said that she did not see a slave in her companion. And she also asked him not to look at her like a lover. At the same time, another thought came to her pink head. If you don't remove the stigma from a young man, he will never leave her and won't go far. Lost in her thoughts, she abruptly turned to look at him. Many regrets burned in her heart. She bowed her head and pressed her hand against his chest. Then she extended her palm towards Van. With this gesture from the greenhouse, she invited him to go further together. Hesitantly, he extended his hand towards her. And then their fingers gently touched. Strange sensations overwhelmed the young man. He tried to feel everything unusual about the moment. His strong fingers pressed more confidently on her soft palm. At that moment, Adelia was trying to remember if Servan had ever taken her hand. She squeezed his fingers tighter. So, holding hands, he followed her into the greenhouse. Many plants of strange shapes and colors bloomed around. Adelia looked around thoughtfully as Servan watched her, his gaze fixed on the rima pots. He asked if his companion could bring him all these plants. Van wondered if it was really necessary to carry everything, because they had a very strong aroma. A mysterious smile crossed the princess's face again. Among the green leaves, the pink-haired girl looked like a flower, while her gaze filled with more and more confidence in her actions. Inside Furanios, the war will begin, followed by an epidemic, a terrible fungal disease that causes skin necrosis. Called gustia, the cause of the disease will not be known. Soldiers with reduced immunity will be very susceptible to it, and the cure is rimla. Many seedlings of this plant were grown in Alcarian's greenhouses, even before it became scarce. The princess planned to grow so many rima plants that there would be many times more than the prince. And she would make sure Elaine was armed with a medicine against gustia. This way they will have an advantage against Alcarian's army, which will painfully die out. Adelia decided to plant rimla in the garden so that its wonderful aroma would be everywhere. There was not a soul in the greenhouse, only two young people planning to deceive fate. Servan heard my lady's plan and said he would do whatever his mistress ordered without any problems. However, his people have a special tradition that fits this moment. When a Celagelian plants flowers in a girl's garden, it means he declares his love for her. Although it is unlikely that my lady knows these traditions. Adelia also thought about it and realized that she wanted to plant flowers together, so she made this offer to Servan. The Celagelian also remembered that if a girl continues to care for a flower, it means she reciprocates. Unfortunately or fortunately, Adelia is also unaware of these details. With tenderness in his eyes and a hint of sadness, Servan unconditionally agreed to plant flowers together. The only thing left was to decide when to start. Adelia finds herself in the middle of the street in her camouflage cloak and calls for Van. She decided to check if her companion was bored, and now they are ready to go home. The boxes are full of rima seedlings, and it seems there are too many. Servan assures her that he will carry all the boxes without problems, although Adelia tries to offer her help. Suddenly, something unusual appears before their eyes. The boxes with seedlings are wrapped in a shiny, magical mist. The wooden weight is placed in Servan's strong hands. The young man explains that with the help of magic, he bound and fixed the boxes, so now he can carry them safely with both hands. And nothing will fall apart. Following the young man, the girl walks along the sidewalk and asks him if her companion has studied magic. And since when does he know how to use magic? He actually knew magic from the beginning, because Van was brought to the princess's house when he was 9 years old. Servan replies that among the Celagelians, this is the age when one needs to be independent. A hard nomadic life strengthens the sons of his people. He was initiated into warriors at the age of 8 in Salagilian. Warrior sounds like Terra. Adelia feels confused by this story and a little irritated, because this means that Servan still knew about magic. The young man assures the girl that he likes the slow life in the city. For him, it is like a vacation, even though he is in slavery. In the dim light, Servan says that he is truly happy. Adelia thought about how cruel the life of nomads is if children become warriors at the age of 8. How he lived. At the same time, she decides to help her knight by reducing the weight of his burden with the help of magic. The girl reminds the young man that with the help of magic, weight can be reduced and sometimes it is better to be cunning and a little lazy. Servan says he does not want to use this method because it is not difficult for him. Besides, sometimes he is also a little lazy or cunning. For example now. Adelia does not believe him and laughs at this statement. At that moment, Van realizes that something has happened to the boxes. It seems the princess has spent all her magical power and is tired, which caused concern in her companion. He is also surprised by the lightness of the boxes. It seems that even a child could handle them this way. However, Milady's fatigue is obvious, and Servan is worried about this. It is not in his spirit to remain idle, so the young knight offers to share his magical power with the princess. This proposal disarms the pink-haired maiden because of its sudden nature. The method of transferring magical power is very simple. The donor must touch the recipient's skin with their lips and inhale air. Adelia turns these rules over in her mind and is horrified. They had almost reached the house. The mana would recover only after sleep, but I wonder why Servan suggested this. And she had never used this method. Somewhere the princess heard that it felt good, and extending her hand towards Van. She decided to try it. Servan seems surprised that Milady has agreed, and slowly places the seedling boxes on the ground. Kneeling on one knee, he gently takes her hand in his. Like a true knight, Servan, just in case, asked the lady for permission, which embarrassed her even more. Taking her response as an order and the action itself as a duty, he slowly brought his lips close to her palm. When the princess's hand was very close, he opened his mouth. And then his lips eagerly sucked the air from Adelia's palm. It seems the sensations were not what the girl expected to feel. She screams for him to stop. The strange feeling grows with every second. The power flowed inward in waves, while the embarrassed Servan continued casting a spell on Adelia's palm. Does she need to stop? Take her hand away. Is this madness? She asks him to stop. But despite the girl's scream, Van does not stop. A tremor ran through Adelia's body, and her eyes filled with tears. It is night. 2 people are standing near seedling boxes in the street, trying to catch their breath. The young man is confused, blushed, and sweated because he was scared from not hearing his mistress's voice. This was the first time he transferred magic to a person, which is why it turned out so awkward. He apologizes. Adelia seemed to be upside down, almost died, and couldn't even imagine that everything would be like this. She looks up and sees a scared Servan, who continues to apologize. He flinched in fear and was obviously surprised that he couldn't stop in time. Adelia doesn't want to reproach her knight for anything and tries to calm him with words that everything is fine for her. Her only request is not to do this next time. With these words, the young man completely melted, and he was truly inspired that he would be allowed to do this again. Milady replied that with her small magical potential, she would need help more than once. To which he received assurances that next time, the young man would control himself. The weather was sunny. Clouds constantly floated across the blue sky. Tea splashes in the princess's cup as she meticulously recalls the events of that night. Servan suddenly hesitated and said he needed to be alone. Adelia started to worry about his condition and decided to ask him if he was in any pain. She reached out to wrap her fingers around his large palm, when suddenly Servan abruptly shook his hand, hitting the princess. In horror, she realized what he had just done. Her eyes filled with fear. Adelia clearly did not expect this action and tried to trace what had just happened. Stuttering, Van apologized profusely while still sweating profusely. The pink-haired girl adopted a threatening look and began to ask questions about her companion's behavior, to which she received 1,000 more apologies and a request to leave him alone. He turned around and ran away, without answering her calls to return. The girl in the blue dress is now sitting at the glass table, having taken a break for tea. And she wonders why Servan ran away then. Under her windows, a dark-haired slave is pulling a cart. She tries to understand what his thoughtful gaze means. Adelia closely observes the worker's every move and emotion. Yesterday he hit her and simply ran away. Now she definitely won't leave him alone. Elegant white fingers drummed on the window glass. The sound attracted the attention of a thoughtful young man below. In an authoritarian tone, the majestic lady ordered him to approach her. Her face was stern and determined. To emphasize the meaning of the words, she pointed out that it was necessary to do it now. Servan silently looked at my lady's soy. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The young man turned shy and headed towards the castle. Still lost in her thoughts, the princess felt she had done everything right. Now it was time to act. Suddenly, she jumped off her chair and started running. The girl looked seriously at her beautiful reflection in the mirror. From head to toe, she was irresistible, her soft, fair skin shone. In a relaxed posture, she sank onto the bed and smoothed her hair. Adelia looked beautiful, with her girlish charms ready. Waiting for a guest was tedious and unpleasant. It seems she had to wait even longer than she expected. The girl looked at the door and couldn't understand why he hadn't come yet. The situation began to irritate her, and she cursed out loud while grabbing the pillow. A familiar voice from behind the door interrupted the angry speeches. Servan said quietly that, in fact, he had already arrived. It turns out he had been standing outside the door for some time and heard everything, although he tries to pretend he wasn't spying on the princess at all. Milady ordered the young man to enter, and he skillfully found himself on the other side of the painted bedroom door. His hair was tousled with a slight carelessness, and drops of clean water ran down his cheeks, flushed with embarrassment. The realization that Servan had just washed his face completely confused the girl. She asked him to sit down and massage her hands, to which she received a veiled refusal out of courtesy. Milady remembered that she felt tired and needed a massage, but Servan suggested that in this case, she should simply share his magical power. It would be more effective for combating fatigue than a massage, and he was ready to do it right now. Servan promised that this time, the lady would not be exhausted. The proposal seemed interesting to Adelia, but she still tried to maintain a tone of severity. And she made the young man promise to stop at her first word. Servan approached her and gently moved towards the bed. With a languid look framed by damp hair, he looked at her. He rested his hand on her palm, buried in the soft sheets, moving closer to my lady. When Servan had almost touched the princess's soft skin with his lips, a shout was heard from the hallway. Calling my lady. For a moment, the two young people froze in a strange, intimate position, but very quickly they had to move away from each other. The girl turned away and sank into the pillow, embarrassed, while the approaching voice kept calling her. They informed her that Mr. Faggleton had brought her a family ring, so the messenger was in a hurry to report it. And the princess, still catching her breath from the recent closeness, tried to understand what kind of gentleman this was. A very necessary thought reached her and helped her remember that this was a blacksmith. Faggleton could only have come on behalf of the commissioner. But he ran away, what an ungrateful rascal. However, Van has a great idea how to find the fugitive. The young man is quite confident in his words and abilities. In his hands, he holds a ghostly map of the city. Adelia shines with joy. She had no idea that Servan could use search magic, because even she does not have this ability. Thanks to the magic map and the magic crystal, you can see that the blacksmith is running straight into the princess's hands. Once again, the joint landing of Rima failed, which annoyed Adelia. Servan noticed a strange movement on the map. The knight decided to catch the fugitive with his own hands. He rolled up the map, and Adelia asked not to use assault, because the blacksmith has a very valuable skill. The faithful servant, not without sadness in his eyes, unconditionally agrees to this condition. It is hot outside again and sunny. City residents rush through the streets, carrying out their daily activities. A young man stands under the walls of a stone house and thinks about the bearer of a special ability. It would be better if my lady relied only on himself. After all of Servan's thoughts are already occupied with Lady Adelia. Whoever this blacksmith is, Van really doesn't like him. Maybe he should break both his arms so he can never be useful again. After all, he was in slavery. There are all sorts of wounds. Maybe, if you simply deny your guilt, Adelia will believe that it wasn't him who did it. From all these thoughts, Servan sighed deeply. It would be better if he had never known the pleasure of giving her his magical resources. The issue is not with him, but with her. If it weren't for that incident, Van would have remained a submissive and humble slave. Whatever my lady wants. And now he is different, and she doesn't understand what is happening. She trusts and relies on her servant. This is more than a lover knight could expect, but still, he wants more. And here the sounds of the fugitive, coming from the other side of the street, are heard. Servan came out of the tangle of loving thoughts and stood at attention. The boots with small heels did not walk fast, but still allowed their owner to quickly cover the distance. A red-haired young man ran down the street with all his might. He is very afraid of being pursued, so he looks back from time to time. Although he should have looked better ahead, where the real trap awaited him. Servan simply put his foot in front of the runner, and of course, he stumbled over him. The young man fell noisily onto the sun-warmed sidewalk stone. Servan, with feigned seriousness, asked about the well-being of the athlete. A strong hand grabbed the boy's clothes. Van started to lift the blacksmith from the ground and responded to the cries of pain with malicious comments. The Celagelian asked convincingly to do what Milady ordered, to which he received scared consent. Servan dragged the boy to the corner of the house and assessed the situation. He let go of the blacksmith on the condition that he shut his mouth and followed him if he wanted to live. Of course, the red-haired young man could not walk on his own and simply fell to the ground. From the other end of the street, Adelia asked if Van had caught the fugitive. Servan had to grab the boy's hand tightly again. He passed the blacksmith's other arm over his shoulder to support the young man instead of his own legs. Feigning concern, Servan squeezed the green-eyed fugitive's shoulder tighter. The sensations were extremely painful, so the young man cried out. Servan did not like the screams and simply shrugged off the unpleasant burden at Adelia's incomprehensible gaze. He tried to explain to the blacksmith that no one was going to kill him, and moreover, he saved him. And he, ungrateful, still tried to escape, but the young man promised to do whatever was necessary only if Servan was taken away from him. Servan tries to convince Milady to take the young man to the doctor, but fears he might escape again. Van says the boy has already learned that trying to escape will lead to nothing good. The man is an animal with a brain. This is called a conditioned reflex. The princess doesn't like this situation because she helped the blacksmith, and now Servan is simply being fooled. Servan reminds her that this is an important person. Now he panics because he doesn't understand what is happening, and the lady might show him mercy. Now Adelia turns her attention to the knight himself because it seems his heart hurts. Standing in the shadow of the house, he looked at her face, illuminated by sunlight. Adelia could not look him in the eyes and felt embarrassed. Servan was also confused because a strange thought arose in his head. He said that he was actually a little tired and that he also wanted to do this with my lady. At first the princess did not understand what exactly it was, but then she truly understood. He used such complex magic and spent a lot of energy. However, the more he spends, the more energy he has. Clouds floated in the blue sky above the rooftops of the houses. Servan said that tonight he wanted to feel freedom with my lady. An awkward silence settled between the young people. Meanwhile, the third participant in the action thought about how innocent this pink-haired girl was. In such a situation, of course, nobody cares about the beaten blacksmith. Servan looks like a real monster, threatening the poor girl. But then Adelia raised her voice, turning to the red-haired boy, telling him that according to imperial law, if a person steals money, they must compensate for the loss 12 times. If a person runs away, then it is no different from a thief. Plus the compensation amount multiplied by 12 results in 96 million dara that the blacksmith must pay. The young man clearly did not expect such a turn. Meanwhile, the sweet girl remembered the growing interest and began to look more and more like the devil in person. However, she offered an alternative way to pay the debt. Adelia handed the young man a roll of paper. The sword details were drawn in the drawings, but this was not enough for the blacksmith who was seeing this for the first time. Then the princess mentioned that she had more drawings, which delighted the young man. Unlike current weapons, this not only increases Aya's attack power, but it also allows a common soldier to use the power of Aya's face. And these weapons will be created by this person in the future anyway. A malicious smile appeared on my lady's face. She offers the drawings to the blacksmith in exchange for a signed contract. There is now a real treasure in her slender fingers. The blacksmith's green eyes shone at the thought of working on this project. He happily accepted the princess's terms of cooperation. Night fell over the city. The full moon illuminated the treetops near the castle. In Servan's room, the candlelight flickered faintly. Adelia sighed deeply and declared that she was terribly tired. The blacksmith bombarded her with many questions about the sword and the stones. Now even her tongue ached from the amount of explanations given. There are really only candles to illuminate his servant's room. Servan, holding a candelabra in his hands, felt ashamed of the lack of normal light. Adelia tried not to embarrass him, but darkness actually made her nervous. So, it's time to do what they might have interfered with in her room. This time she asks Serban not to stop, although telling him to stop gives him the right to decide what to do. Van, full of determination, wraps his fingers around her wrist. He gently removes my lady's hands because he does not want to hurt them again. Adelia realizes that this time she will not tell him to stop. However, Van still remembers that he will stop at just one word from her. The princess turns around and says that he can stop when she loses the desire. Now is the time to act, and she bares her neck. Servan looks at her with a tender gaze. He slowly moves his lips toward her warm skin. The girl is tense, but Servan asks her to relax. You must not force your arms because they are still injured. There is magic in the air. Servan felt a strange and unpleasant magical force from the other side. This is not the magical power of Milady or Gerard. This is the power of a stranger. Servan's eyes filled with horror. Adelia was running out of strength. She asked him to stop because she couldn't take any more. The young man got scared and asked to check something because he felt a strange magic that the girl knew nothing about. She is very tired. She asks him to finish tomorrow. It is better not to do everything at once. It is better to do it all the time. But Servan convincingly says that he needs to finish it in one go. In his request to my lady, he addresses her by her name. Adelia is completely disarmed by his desire, as it is the first time he has asked her for something. She leans back and agrees to fulfill this whim. Servan feels flattered, and his interest is further ignited. He promises to sort everything out quickly. The young man moves even closer to the princess. He needs to search quickly. He tries to understand the reason for this strange sensation. Suddenly, something comparable to an explosion happens. The magic sword pierced the center of the blue lily. In El Carrion's castle, the violet stone begins to exhibit strange vibrations. The crystal breaks, and a piece flies out at high speed. It wounds the cheek of the frightened prince. This seems to mean that the magic has dissipated. Servan calls my lady with all his might. It seems he is not feeling well. He clearly doesn't feel well, but he asks not to worry because she is alive and conscious. The young man is very worried about Adelia and asks if she is tired. The princess almost cries from fatigue, but she doesn't show it, as the night will start to worry. Servan's palm slid under my lady's back and lifted her slightly onto the pillow. With the other hand, he creates a stream of water, so he asks Adelia to open her mouth so he can give her a drink. Drops of pure liquid go directly into the princess's open mouth. When the flow ended, she threw her head back and swallowed it all. The unusual sensations required detailed consideration. Adelia had never drunk like that before. She was even more surprised by Van's stamina because he had already used a lot of magic. And he could still do these things. The young man apologized again for what happened. Adelia accepted the apologies, saying that everything was fine. Now my lady thought how much she regretted running away after such a thing. She decided to make sure Van was satisfied, because this is where the princess wanted to finish today. However, Van's voice trembled too much when he agreed with Adelia's opinion. That is why he had to say once again, convincingly, that he was very satisfied with everything. It is true that there is one more thing he wants to check, because he discovered a strange magic on Milady's body. Adelia is examined every year by many doctors and priests. Servan explains that the spell was cast in such a way that it could not be detected unless performed by a very careful person. Milady joked, saying that Van was a real monster in magic, of which there are few. But the young man took these words too seriously, so they had to calm him down. The magical spell that Adelia barely has is difficult to find if one does not have the magic of telepathy. And at that moment, the girl could not even imagine who left it on her and why. Before regression, she never found herself in life-threatening situations. Now she is an ordinary girl. Servan suggested finding traces of the spell, even though it did not harm Milady. The young man has a bad feeling about this. Since the spell broke, the caster should have noticed if necessary. Servan can remove it and check the girl every day, of course, before the trace quickly disappears. At that moment, the young man blushed, and Adelia said that if he behaved like that, she would too. It remains to find out the places Servan needs to check. He believes it is necessary to look at the back of the head. And a little bit on the back. However, the girl began to worry because she was sweating, and her lover would not see her in the best light. Servan said he would have to touch certain areas, which might be awkward. But that he needed to limit his search. Adelia mustered her courage. Determination appeared in her eyes. She reminded Van that it was not his fault, so he did not need to put on a guilty face when talking about such things. Milady said she was going to undress, so Van needed to turn off the light. The young man felt a little embarrassed and picked up a candle. In an instant, he extinguished the lit wick. The room was plunged into complete darkness, as there were no windows. Adelia said that she herself could not reach her back and needed Van's help, which confused the young man even more. She pretended to be naive and helpless so that Servan would approach her. Tight ribbons that encircled the princess's silhouette fell off. Slowly, Van untied Milady's neck ribbon. The girl's heart beat faster, and she worried if Serban was experiencing the same thing. She squeezed his fingers and wondered if he was worried. All her thoughts and hopes boiled down to the fact that she wanted Van to see her as a girl. Adelia was pulled out of her thoughts by Van's voice, who found what he was looking for. The girl was disappointed that it happened so quickly. Servan stared fixedly at the spot where he found the spell. His hand lay on the girl's soft pink neck, and under the palm, a barely perceptible magical trace shone. A new day brings new troubles to the walls of the Gerard castle. The princess is sitting at a carved mahogany desk with a butler beside her. Many neatly arranged books are in the office. On the table are important letters and notes, while my lady's interlocutor thinks about the union of the gallon. Meanwhile, the girl's thoughts are occupied with completely different topics. She wonders how many people could have touched her neck. And this number is large even without considering the large number of maids. If they use hair as an excuse, it will also be easy to approach other maids. Even the butler Haley falls under suspicion. His eyes were always cold when he looked at the other butlers. The lady is burying her thoughts, so she had to answer my interlocutor about the development of the business when suddenly my lady was called. His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, has arrived. Alcarian earls entered the room with a malicious smile. The prince of the country, earls, ordered the servants to leave the premises. He wanted to speak with Adelia alone. The butler and the girl who came with the prince said their goodbyes. Alcarian feigned optimism and goodwill and asked the princess why she was silent. He recalled that it had been a long time since they had seen each other, while Adelia gripped the pen in her hand tighter. Ordering her thoughts, nightmares associated with this man still haunt her every night. Alcarion, who took everything from her, while saying that 4 years have passed since the moment they met. Adelia was 15 then. With a trembling hand, Milady held the unfortunate pen, from which ink was dripping. She thought about how to kill the prince. But it is too early for this. Besides, she managed to change the future. It only remains to find out why he came. Finally, she calmly put the pen aside and said she was very surprised. The princess got up from the table, made a polite bow, and apologized. Her lips stretched into a feigned, naive smile. She greeted the crown prince of the empire with great honor and blessed him with the name Haystack. This surprised the prince, because last time she mentioned Arya and not Haystack. Because Haystack is the god of war and Arya is the god of love. Adelia laughed at the situation and remembered that she used to think Alcarion was a fairy tale prince. Not like now, of course. When people greet each other in the Earl's empire, they must pray for God's blessing. The name of the god who praises men's courage, the god of war, is Haystack. He is a very cold and extremely just god, also known as the god of punishment. Adelia was pleased to think that Haystack might punish this rascal. Alcarion noticed that the princess hadn't grown up at all, and he himself was tired of the terrible things in the capital. And he decided to see the girl. It seems the prince's heart is now completely clear. Alcarion also believes that the Margrave is a heartless father, because Adelia is still too young to continue her father's work. The prince stroked the girl's cheek and told her that she could always turn to him for help. He also asked permission to stay at the castle and have dinner together. Then the prince left with a slam of the door. The princess was angry because now she too would have to have dinner with this rascal. The sun shone brightly in the blue sky. Alcarion looked out the window. Several thoughts needed to be carefully considered. The butler is nearby and listens as the prince mentions the name of Margrave Gerard. I wonder if he is aware of the prince's arrival. He probably already knows. It cannot be that the stern old man returned to the territory as soon as he learned of Alcarion's arrival, because he didn't even properly take care of his daughter. The prince wonders if all this was in vain. He came to understand whether Adelia knew or not what had happened. Replaying the scene of their meeting, it seems to him that the princess seemed normal. He will never know that the Gerard clan has elven blood, a noble family dedicated to serving and protecting people, as evidenced by the characteristic color of their eyes and hair. It is unclear why the curse was lifted. It was cast a long time ago and is not so easy to remove. Surely the magic stone cannot withstand so much energy from the elves. It is easy to transfer a curse. The only problem is the magic stone, because first-level stones of such a large size are rare. Even the crown prince of earls took a long time to find one. The only thing the young man can do is observe what happens. Selene, a royal knight, was worried that Alcarion was spending too much time in the sun. The blonde prince agreed, because it had been a long time since he had such a rest. He thanked the servant for his concern. Selena was confused by these words and the fact that the knight called her by name. Alcarion looked at her with a malicious smile. It is quite interesting to create outstanding talents for your subordinates. It is similar to collecting and exhibiting jewelry. If only he had given her more knowledge. The voice of the workers was heard in the street, and among the conversations, a familiar name was pronounced. Outside the window, a strong young man worked tirelessly. I wonder if this young man is a slave of Selejil. He looks very strong and has no trouble carrying heavy objects. Although it doesn't seem like he can use magic correctly, the prince can still use it somehow. Suddenly, Alcarion notices something very interesting on the slave's hand. At first he is speechless and opens his mouth in surprise. And then a malicious smile appears on his face. After all, on the young man's wrist, there is clearly a bracelet with magic stones. Under the bright sun, many slaves work at the edge of the forest. One of the workers lifts a large amount of wood in one go. At that moment behind him, the other servants froze in surprise at what they saw. A confident voice noted that externally Servan does not seem as strong as he really is. Prince Elkarion also said that people like Milady Adelia's servant are rare among the Selagilians. The blond young man stood at the edge of the forest in all his glory, surrounded by his entourage. All the workers stopped what they were doing and fell to their knees in front of the real person. Servan slowly placed his load on the green grass and knelt down next to the rest of the workers without looking up at the prince. Elkarion approached the slave who interested him. In an authoritarian tone, he addressed Van with the order to stand up. The young man had a bad feeling. Kneeling on one knee, Servan did not stand up completely, but remained half-squatting. He nodded respectfully with his head, greeting the prince, but still did not look up. Elkarion, with a brazen smile, turned to Servan with a question. He was very concerned about how a magic stone ended up on the slave's hand. This is not the kind of thing a subordinate can have, as the owner's permission is required. The prince mentioned Adelia's name, thus alarming Servan. At that moment, Selina, the royal knight, noticed that something was wrong. She quickly realized that the prince was in danger. The slave looked too ruthless. A strange energy emanated from him. Moreover, in his eyes there was neither reverence nor fear of royalty. Selina realized that this was a murderous aura and grabbed her sword in horror. Servan said that he received the bracelet for occasionally acting as the lady's guard when she leaves the house. The prince was surprised, but admitted that it might well be so. He was also interested in how well the slave handled a magic stone, and if he could use a level 3 magic stone. Moreover, Elkarion believes that Aya is standing in front of him. Servan notes that the prince is right and says that because he is Selagilian, he does not have much magical power. And it is at a low level. Adapting to the situation, the young man also noticed that level 3 is his limit, which means he can only use magic to attack. The prince put his hand on his chin, humming thoughtfully. Despite the humble presentation, it is not unusual for a Selagilian to be an IAC. Perhaps even more insignificant than Elkarion thought. With a malicious smile, the young blonde said that he had lost something valuable, which means it was time to buy something new. He pointed out that Servan has been in slavery for 10 years, and that such people should not rot in such a place, so that the prince can save him despite the slave being a Selagilian. In a convincing and authoritative tone, Elkarion invited Haben to enter his service. The dark-haired young man stood opposite. No emotions were visible on his face. He really did not want to answer the prince at all, but he realized that this was probably a man of royal blood. All the slave's thoughts were even now occupied with my lady's safety. So he coldly replied to Elkarion that Adelia Gerard had been his mistress for 10 years, and that she would remain so. The prince took these words with some irony, because a slave cannot choose his master. Although he himself wouldn't want to have a slave who is easily capable of betrayal. However, the prince really doesn't like idiots who waste their opportunities. And if Servan has a brain, he will make the right decision. Now, completely without a smile and with a threatening look, Elkarion repeated his question about who owns the Selagilian. Servan understood that the prince was only expecting a correct answer to this question. But he still said he only had one mistress. With these words, he only provoked the prince with sadistic inclinations. Elkarion's eyes filled with madness. He compared Servan to a dog that already has a home. The prince ordered his royal guard servants to tie the insignificant slave to a tree, just in case they took away his magic stone bracelet. Servan looked indifferently at the royal knights, roughly understanding what awaited him now. Of course he hates being beaten, but dealing with the prince is simply unbearable. Options about the best way to act in this situation are spinning in the slave's head. After all, even now he remembers Delia, with her restless gaze and cheeks reddened by anxiety. Are my lady's eyes destined to fill with tears again? No, Servan decisively realized that nothing bad would happen if he was beaten a little. The voice of the blonde bastard was heard again. He is surprised that Gerard doesn't know how to raise slaves properly. There isn't even a scratch on the servant's body. Servan's gaze was calm, he seemed reserved. Elkarion looked at the slave with hatred. It annoyed him that Servan was so calm and didn't even tremble. The time had come to punish Milady's servant. For ruining the mood of a member of the royal family, he will receive the 2 cases. The prince decided to punish the deceitful criminal himself, regardless of the number of beatings. The slave's calmness and arrogance harshly struck the prince's pride. He angrily waved his whip, and a characteristic click sounded in the air. The warm sunlight falls on the colorful walls, the golden chandeliers, and the expensive paintings of the royal palace cabinet. Adelia is sitting at her desk, immersed in heavy thoughts. To think of a strategic plan for the future, she invariably replays images from the past in her memory. If she only wants to save Servan, now the princess cannot give up everything for him. No matter how perfect Elcarian's knights were, no one could stop Van. If the Earl's royal family dies in Gerard's colony, then all the blame will fall on Adelia's father. The blame for failing to protect the royal family, and the father will be deprived of his life because of this. What was he thinking then? Perhaps he wanted revenge for the betrayal, or it was still a feeling of hopelessness. Milady struck the table with her fist and said that her father had always been honest. And despite everything, the girl really wants to meet her father. And she must bring that same man to Gerard. Hugh Crouch, owner of the shop, you can learn a lot from this man. In fact, he is more of a scientist than a merchant, as he even conducted his own research. But despite all this, no one from the nobility invested in him, so the situation with his research barely changed. Now we have to decide what is best for working with him. It definitely has to be a magic stone and mana. You must think about how good this plan is. A loud noise was heard in the hallway, and my lady was very frightened by the sudden noise. The blue-eyed butler burst into the office, shouting, scared. Adelia looked inquisitively at the guest and asked why he scared her so much. The servant apologized and, trying to calm his gasping breath, said that His Highness wanted to punish Servan with the help of fellatio. Adelia knows very well that this is a form of punishment with a whip, so her face froze in horror. The princess ran as fast as she could under the stone arches of the castle. With slender fingers, she held the hem of her dress. The wind ruffled her pink hair. She won't even allow the prince to touch Servan with a finger. Feelings overwhelmed her. The scoundrel's insidious smile swirled in her head. Anyone he touches suffers because of him. However, this time she will be able to avoid disaster. A girl's cry was heard among the green leaves of the trees. She ordered what was happening to stop and spread her arms to the sides. Adelia stood in a protective position between the hated scoundrel and the Knight of the Heart. Servan would have been happy to see her, but now he was just very worried about my lady. Elcarian did not expect to see Adelia. Genuine surprise was visible on his face. He noticed the girl's reddened cheeks and asked why she was running there while the princess tried to control her rapid breathing. In a determined tone, she said that this slave was hers, and no one would dare touch him in her presence. And besides, if he is guilty somewhere, then Adelia takes full responsibility. Giving her voice even more confidence and an authoritative tone, she demanded the young man be released. This unexpected scene was not part of the prince's plans, so for a second he felt embarrassed. However, he quickly composed himself and asked if the princess was sure that no one dared to touch the slave. After all, Elcarian is a very difficult person. Firstly, he is a prince and a future ruler, something Adelia should not forget. Who gave her the right to stop the real person? Adelia felt a little embarrassed, but she didn't show it. Composing herself, she said that the prince had misunderstood her. According to the laws of the empire, if a slave makes a mistake, his master can bear the full punishment instead of the slave. And Elcarian, as a prince, must be more respectful of the empire's laws. Adelia remembered that she was not offending anyone, and that the law of the empire was, above all else, the will of the emperor. And besides, the prince cannot go against the emperor in the presence of so many people. The blonde bastard looked aside with boredom. He is right in his words, he is not yet on the throne. In a calm voice, he said that he would turn a blind eye to what was happening due to Adelia's youth. But next time, everything would be different. Elcarian thought about how the girl always pretended to be white and fluffy, but thanks to this slave. She revealed her true essence, and now nothing certain will happen. He miscalculated and did not take into account that he had contacted the wrong person. Angry, the prince waved his whip again, saying that all people make mistakes. Adelia's gaze filled with horror. She prepared for the inevitable. The whip was in the air, aimed at the defenseless dark-haired young man. The princess looked at her lover with a scream. Her actions were filled with determination. Without fear of dangerous weapons, she protected the knight's body with her own. Alcarion was angry about this outburst. Adelia huddled together, preparing to receive a blow from the whip. Servan could not afford to remain idle, even though his hands were literally tied. Suddenly he had a plan. Fire gleamed in his eyes. A ray appeared in the air and hit the crown of a large tree. Everyone was worried, trying to comprehend the state of His Highness. Selina quickly oriented herself and ordered that a stretcher be brought quickly. She became furious and asked who dared to attack His Highness. Adelia's calm voice pulled her out of her thoughts about finding her attacker. Milady saw in Selina's words pressure on Lady Gerard and accusations against her. The princess's face was calm and serious. She asked if Selina blamed her for what happened. The royal knight began to make excuses, stuttering that she had never thought anything like that. She only explained that if it was an intruder, then my lady would also be in danger. But Adelia convincingly says that what happened by the whim of heaven. To prove her words, she cites the fact that not a single magic stone reacted. But to use magic you need to use a stone, and IA can feel how it works. There are many warriors here, but none felt magic. Selina could not argue these facts, so she lowered her eyes with guilt. She was ashamed to ask, but she had no other choice, so she still asked Adelia if she would like medical help from the Gerards. The princess was understanding and gave a positive answer. Selina bowed courteously and thanked her lady. As Alcarion was being led out of the clearing, Adelia could barely contain her laughter. Now is the time to examine Van and understand how badly he was injured. The rest of the servants at that moment released the young man from the ropes. Adelia was very worried about the mark on Van's wrist, but he assured her that nothing was wrong with him. Servan was concerned that it looked like he had behaved badly and insulted the lady. And the girl said that no one had the right to stop him like that. She also asked him to change his clothes. With his shirt unbuttoned and rope marks on his strong arms, he looked incredible. Adelia looked at her lover so much that it aroused concern in him. He approached, took her hands in his, and asked if she was sure that they hadn't hit her during the blow. The princess felt very embarrassed by this and quickly moved away, throwing a scarf to Van so he could cover himself with it. Adelia's bedroom was brightly lit with many bulbs. She asks Servan to wait for her here until she finishes her work. The princess believes the young man needs to rest, although he himself doesn't feel tired and, besides, he still needs to find a trusted object. Milady finds it difficult to argue with a servant, so she raises his chin with her hand and convincingly asks him to rest, and Servan agrees. Looking into his pure and innocent eyes, Adelia apologizes. Her posture is full of genuine remorse as she continues to apologize. Servan admires her with tenderness and devotion. No matter what his mistress did, he would always believe in her innocence, and he hated that my lady apologized to him. Their fingers intertwined when Van said he would do whatever his mistress wished. Adelia was moved by his words and thanked him. A sincere smile appeared on her face, and her eyes became a little moist with tears. The princess promised to reimburse the knight for everything after his help. But for now, she leaves the room to attend to her own affairs. Looking peacefully, Van watches her leave. However, as soon as the door closes, Servan grimaces in pain. It seems it is time to finish one thing. Night has fallen over the city. Among the clouds, twinkling stars can be seen. Moonlight enters through the window of one of the castle rooms. Selina sits on the floor. Her posture expresses powerlessness and hopelessness. The girl is immersed in heavy thoughts. She remembered how today she watched the efforts for her master's health. Adelia did everything possible to care for the prince's well-being. Selina could do nothing, she just stood there and watched. The royal knight's thoughts are completely occupied with memories of her mistress's smile. How happy he was that she was on his side. These moments make the girl feel embarrassed. Her cheeks turn red. She is just an ordinary human slave with little talent, nothing more than an object that can be replaced at any time. And no matter how hard she tries, she remains a toy. Even knowing everything in advance, she continues to endure day after day, unable to get rid of the suffering. A strange sound rang out in the hallway, pulling the girl out of her thoughts. She got up and called the uninvited guest. There was only silence in response. Selena tensed up. Her hand automatically reached for her sword. A familiar voice announced quite confidently that he had come to take what was his. A tall young man entered the room. Selena was surprised, looking at him. Servan came to retrieve what was entrusted to him. The young man reiterated his request again to return what had been taken from him. Selena didn't understand immediately, but then realized they were talking about a bracelet. Servan confirmed that he was the one who came to look for it, as the item originally belonged to the lady. The girl wondered how the young man knew she was here, and also that she couldn't simply give away the bracelet without the master's permission. Servan was convincing in his posture and gaze. Selena knows this is just a slave, but his aura is a bit scary. The bracelet is finally back on the young man's injured wrist. The thought that my lady's gift was with him again made Servan blush. This look did not go unnoticed by Selena. She knows those eyes well. It's like looking in the reflection. It's a familiar feeling. A slave who loves his master, but has a better situation than the girl. It seems his mistress truly values her female slave. Selena asked if it was true that her mistress had given this bracelet to Servan. And she received an affirmative answer. The girl lowered her eyes thoughtfully and apologized for taking the item. She said she should have returned the item immediately, but she couldn't. As Van turned around and was about to leave, Selena shouted for him to stop. And she approached Van to grab his hand. However, catching the young man was not so easy. He easily dodged the unwanted tactile contact. The royal knight was astonished by the quick movements of Adelia's slave. His talent is too high for an ordinary person, but Servan stopped to listen to the girl. Van's talent is even more impressive considering he is Celagelian. Although this will not save him, she is still a consumable item. In this country, slaves of other races have no future. Even if the mistress also loves him, he will still be unhappy. Although if it concerns that pink-haired girl, perhaps she won't allow this to happen to him. Selena decided to give Van some advice, although no one asked her, and perhaps she shouldn't have said it at all. The girl says that the mistress will let the slave go anyway someday, so it's better for him to go with Elaine. Her words confused the young man at first, but he quickly sorted out his thoughts. And he replied that this would definitely not happen. Then Selena said sympathetically that she herself had been a slave in the past. There is something more significant than being freed from slavery, but without proof that she is a slave. She cannot be with that person. Selena remembers being very scared. The girl composed herself and invited Servan to go to Ellen together with their skills. He would be an excellent mercenary. And if some tragedy occurs, she has no other options to free herself from slavery. Most likely, she won't have any more chances for anything else. Selena looked at the floor and wished that Servan would make the right decision. The gentle sun informed all the inhabitants of Earls about the arrival of a new day. The pink-haired princess stretched and wondered if she had been working too hard lately. On the other hand, everything was going very well, so the girl's mood was appropriate. Hicks, having regained his health, was developing weapons in the forge. The case for which Adelia was going to see Hugh Crouch is progressing smoothly. And although the vile prince appeared at the wrong time and unexpectedly, my lady will continue her journey as soon as she says goodbye to the uninvited guest. You just need to tell Van that he is going with her. I wonder if he will be surprised. Adelia gave Selena the last blessing for His Highness. The royal knight also noted that his lordship would most likely be angry about the princess's departure. My lady wished a favorable journey to the departing procession. Selena wished her the blessing of Judith, the goddess of peace. Standing facing each other, they exchanged final banter. Suddenly, a large flock of snow-white doves crossed the sky. Adelia was even startled by the sudden appearance of the birds. Then she realized that Van, not far away, was also looking at a large number of doves. He was also surprised and looked very sweet in the princess's eyes. Adelia couldn't remember the last time she had seen something like this. Suddenly, the surprise at the beauty of the snow-white birds had terrible consequences. A rain of droppings fell from the sky onto the carriage and the servants of the crown prince. The guard was unprepared for such a turn of events and was terrified. His Highness was literally embarrassed. The faithful servants rushed urgently to correct the situation. Adelia found it difficult to contain her sincere feelings about what she saw. She was trembling a little, doing her best to hide her laughter. Van looked at her with a pure smile, pleased to have managed to cheer up his mistress. In the dimness of my lady's bedroom, sounds of agony were heard. Van's hand rests on the girl's neck, drawing out the negative energy of the curse. The trace of the victim seems fainter and fainter. Adelia turned to Sir Van and asked if he was finished yet. To which she received an affirmative answer. The procedure for today was complete. The girl is tired of the treatment and, at the same time, cannot even imagine what it could be. Milady's shoulder was exposed as the laces of her dress loosened. So Van offered to help tie it. The moment turned out to be quite intimate, so both lovers became embarrassed. Sir Van gently pulled the laces, while Adelia tried to maintain casual conversation. She is surprised that Van can tie his shoelaces without touching her skin at all. Then she decided to joke about his good tying skill and suggested that Sir Van, on the contrary, take care of the tying, which greatly embarrassed the young man. He changed the subject, reported on the performance of his work, and just in case, apologized. In an instant, Van was already on the balcony, exiting through the window. Adelia watched him thoughtfully and decided that it was time to start implementing the plan. A quiet and peaceful night hung over the castle. 2 royal servants honestly guard the princess's chambers. Suddenly, a strange creaking and tapping sound is heard, confusing the young men. The young men are trying to figure out where this sound came from and why the door suddenly opened. They definitely felt a human trace, but they didn't have to think too long. A familiar voice dispelled their doubts. The silhouette of Milady was among the young men. Adelia created the illusion and explained to the young men that she was practicing while walking. She handed a letter to one of the guards and asked him to deliver it to Haley tomorrow morning. One of the servants accepted the task, but still asked if my lady was really going somewhere alone yesterday. The girl asked not to worry because she was just going to church. For some time, the young men wondered if they should follow their mistress. However, after slightly assessing the risks of such an act, they decided to remain at their post. Van's room was dimly lit by a single candle. The young man lay facing the wall, preparing for sleep. Suddenly the door creaked quietly, Sir Van, of course. He noticed but didn't show it. Silent and cautious footsteps were heard. Adelia thought she was acting very stealthily. She approached the servant's bed very closely, and she already extended her hand to suddenly grab the young man. However, Sir Van's heightened instincts and skill did not fail him, and he grabbed the hand of the uninvited guest, pushing her forward. At that moment, he turned to the person who was invading his measured rest, and was very surprised. At that moment, Adelia stumbled and began to fall. There was a crash, and a moment later, the girl was already lying on top of the embarrassed knight. He got up and hesitantly asked why my lady had come to him at this hour, and also what that huge backpack he is carrying on his back is. Cheerfully, Adelia replied that it was a travel backpack, but it only looked huge. In fact, she made it light with magic. Sir Van was still in shock when the lady herself decided to ask the question. She invited Sir Van to go on a trip together. Not believing what he heard, the young man asked if it was true that they had been offered to go on a trip together. Having received an affirmative answer, he got up and said that first he needed to make the bag smaller. With a slight movement of his hand, the huge backpack turned into a small handbag. Its weight was reduced, but its appearance was too noticeable, Now it looks much better. It remains to know where and for how long my lady is going on a trip. Adelia said that their path would pass through Girton's lands, and that in time they should find him in a week so that she could return before her father returned. Besides, my lady has a very busy schedule and will not be able to ride a carriage, so she will have to take horses. Although Servan showed his reservations about this idea, because Adelia had never ridden a horse all day. And before leaving, you definitely need to plant a rimla. They plant one of the trees along with the root. Adelia is interested to know why Servan doesn't ask anything about the intentions and motives for the princess's trip, worrying that he is simply indifferent. The servant would be lying if he said he wasn't interested, but he knows he shouldn't know. The most important thing for him is my lady's safety and the fact that he is her doctor. Adelia's lips curved into a soft smile. This place is visible from the window next to hers, so if he wants to observe the tree planted together, he will be able to do it at any time. The princess greatly enjoyed the activity together and is happy to now have such a shared memory. She would very much like to see traces of joint work every day. Happy, Adelia thanked Aban. She directed magical drops of water over his stained palms. Servan said he would grow a tree for his lady, and now the lady planted a tree for him. Adelia lowered her eyes and felt embarrassed. He tenderly helped her wash the dirt off her hands, and then with a smile suggested finishing what they had already started. The girl looked at him with sincere happiness and nodded, and then they went to the barn to get the horse. A quiet, starry night hung over the kingdom. In the silent tranquility of the forest, the noise of hooves could be heard. Servan carefully helps Milady dismount the horse. The girl resists a little and says she can continue her way, but the skillful knight explains that they won't reach the village until morning anyway. He asks the lady to wait while he sets up the tent. In fact, Adelia is incredibly tired and feels guilty for not being able to continue the journey. And she can't even help set up a tent. While Servan makes preparations for spending the night, he reassures my lady and tells her that he himself was very happy to go on a trip with her, and reminds her that he would have accepted with more pain the fact that the lady left without him, leaving only a letter. Meanwhile, Servan had already set up a tent. The young man notified the princess that everything was ready for the vacation, and she was annoyed because everything happened so quickly. The interior view of the accommodation impressed Adelia with its large space, and Van observed that this was not enough for a comfortable place. The young man said that after taking a hot bath, my lady would sleep much better. And the girl noticed that they did not have such a large container to replace the bath. This statement did not bother Servan. He promised to make the bath himself and took out a small porcelain cup. Adelia couldn't believe what she heard. He could create a bath. However, Van was confident in his abilities, and with the help of magic, he transformed the cup into a huge tub of warm, bubbling water and foam. Servan also added aromatic oils to the water and tried to make the temperature pleasant. However, there is one drawback. The princess never bathed alone, and this fact scared the young man. The girl slowly removed her cloak, trying to figure out with the humble servant what she should do now. The cloak fell from the girl's shoulders to the floor. Servan fell silent, stunned. The girl smiled playfully and asked the young man to help her bathe. All these words did not fit into the poor dear's head. His cheeks flushed with shame. His mistress's proposal resonated in his head. Adelia smiled sweetly and embarrassed Van even more by asking him to help her undress. After all, she has never done this, but Servan knows exactly how. Milady's last words were too much for the young man's tender heart amidst the sweat of excitement. He mumbled something about monsters that could appear at any moment. Van decided that this was a convincing argument and took it to the end. Unable to withstand the pressure of the playful lady, he ran out. The scarf had a peaceful atmosphere of cleanliness. Adelia hummed a simple tune and enjoyed the warm water. She was lucky not to choose the most difficult clothes, so she managed to undress herself. And she really liked the idea of a portable bathtub. Cheerful whistling could be heard from the tent, while Servan remained embarrassed in the street. Suddenly a strong wind rose, which drew the knight's attention. It seems something was wrong with this wind. It was unnatural, as if IA had caused it. The rustling of leaves was heard behind it. Perhaps there was even a fight there. Servan didn't want to get involved in this, but on the other hand, he was worried that the hypersensitive lady would find out about everything. The sounds became louder, and now the running could be clearly heard. Several pairs of legs desperately crossed the space. Apparently, this is a chase, and its participants are approaching the traveler's resting place. There are definitely 2 children among those running, and 2 angry men are chasing them. As expected, these children created a strong wind to hide their tracks. It seems the chase is taking new turns. The girl saw something terrible and is trying to reach her companion. One of the men creates a ball of flaming fire in his hand and directs the flames towards the fugitives. The fiery beast hits the girl's hand. The boy turns horrified and calls her by name. He hugs her and uses water magic to stop the fire. The man lights a new fireball, warning the children that they will be pursued for the rest of their lives anyway. So it is better to stop resisting and die now. The fugitives are already sitting on the ground, huddled together, awaiting the inevitable. The blue-eyed boy tightly hugs the girl. Rage is visible in his gaze when suddenly hope appears in their gases. The flames directed at the children turn into crystals. One of them pierces the attacker's throat. Servan steps aside with a cold gaze. Fragments of crystals fall to the ground with a roar. At that moment, Milady's magic crystal, which lay in her moist palm, began to shine. And Adelia immediately thought of Van. The girl realized that something had happened in the street. Servan silently looks at the image of the former Discordia. The children sit on the ground, huddled, while the bloody body of their pursuer lies nearby. A fragment of crystal lies on the ground, which became the murder weapon. The surviving criminal trembles with fear, because perhaps he is next. Servan approached him and looked at him with indifferent eyes. Thoughts about the best way to deal with this man were spinning in his head. With cold calculation, Wang lit a violet sphere in his hand. In an instant, blood gushed from the criminal's throat. He grabbed him by the neck, but it was useless. A moment later, the man fell dead. Servan cast the same cold look in the other direction. Now he had to decide what to do with the children. He weighed the pros and cons to decide whether it was better to let them go or kill them. Adelia's soft voice came from the tent, asking what was happening. Servan continued to think that if he had touched the child first, the girl would have made a lot of noise. And at that moment, he charged his hand with magic again and replied to Milady that there seemed to be a fight nearby. 2 corpses rose into the air, surrounded by a violet glow. With the easy stimulus of the mage, they began to fly far beyond the boundaries of the lady's shelter. Servan calmly continued the story, explaining that he then saw children running towards them. The blue-eyed boy looked at the formidable monster with fear, but understanding that he should not tell his version of what happened. Adelia came out of the tent, surprised that there were children there. Milady immediately smelled something burning, so the boy decided to say that his sister was seriously injured, and that if the travelers helped them, the children themselves would definitely return this favor in the future. He bowed, begged for help, and the lady began to examine the fugitives in more detail. Their faces and hands are clean, and the magic stone that the boy holds in his hand is also unusual. Perhaps these 2 children are cornered by the war for survival. They do not look like locals, as if they fled from another country. And if they are the nobles of earls, then Adelia does not want to help them. Because these people betrayed the Gerard family, they abandoned their family too easily, which faithfully served the country. They were captured and slandered, while the public turned against them. Servan pulled Milady out of her negative memories, telling her that there was nothing wrong with helping these children. He believes that the fugitives will be able to help Milady in the future. Besides, we must pay attention to their eyes. Wang rarely expresses an opinion with such confidence, which means there is no other way. The children were invited into the tent and told that they would heal their sister. The boy's happiness knew no bounds, his gratitude was abundant. The necessary herbs and infusions for treating the girl were already in the tent. Van was finishing the final preparations for the procedures. The blue-eyed boy was very worried, but Adelia calmed him down by telling him that Van knew how to treat people. Meanwhile, she asked him to take off his cloak himself to help with the wounds. And she was very surprised. A boy, clearly not from Earl's, was washing in front of her. She was surprised that Adelia knew this and explained that in Earl's, most men kept their hair short. The princess was glad that the boy had nothing to do with the nobles of Earl's, and she calmed him down. However, the blue-eyed foreigner decided to clarify whether his stay with his sister would be reported, because it might turn out to be someone who is forbidden to be here. In an even tone, Adelia asked him if he knew who she was. The boy calmly replied that it was not difficult to guess for anyone who saw a pink-haired teenager on the Gerard estate. And with his answer, he pleasantly surprised Milady. If we look at his skin color, he is not from the northern tribes like Servan. Perhaps he belongs to a large aristocratic family from a small neighboring country. Adelia approached the boy, applied a healing ointment to his cheeks, and explained that she was now a simple traveler. So this meeting would have to be kept secret. After the procedure, my lady noticed the resemblance between brother and sister, so the boy smiled at these words. The princess found this happiness strange, since relatives looking alike is the norm. However, it surprised Adelia even more when he said that fate really has no end. In a mysterious tone, the boy said that he was just a weak person who couldn't even protect himself, but that someday he would return the favor. He also called himself Hal. And unfortunately, I cannot say more. However, the next time they meet, he will definitely say his real name. There was a feeling of something magical in the room, and Adelia said she was looking forward to it. She will wait to see how the boy grows, and a smile appeared on her face. The forest where the tent was located fell silent again. Adelia sobbed and snuggled closer to Van as he slept, which greatly embarrassed him. It was unbearable to be so close to her. So Servan put a pillow in her hands and sat down to sort out his thoughts. Suddenly, a voice from the darkness told the young man that he didn't have a drop of dignity. The blue-eyed boy tried to condemn Servan out of shame. Van asked in response if Cal would be ashamed in his place, while lighting his face with the energy sphere in his hand. The boy noticed Van's sensibleness, because not even any strange sound penetrated the tent. But he asked that this should not be considered praise or respect. Servan asked his interlocutor to stop pretending to be a child. Hal said with a malicious smile that he was actually only 13 years old, but he still thanked the young man for treating his sister. After all, thanks to the help, the boy now has time, and at that moment he finally healed the large wound on the girl's back. This trick required too much manpower. Hal noticed that he was currently out of shape. Servan asked if this had anything to do with the injured girl. The unfortunate woman was sleeping with a fever. Her cheeks were red and her breathing was labored. Her brother carefully covered her better. In a mysterious tone, Hal replied that, like his brother, he couldn't do anything else. Servan was very suspicious of the word brother, suspecting that these children were bound by the wrong ties. Hal explained that he and the girl were distant relatives, so they couldn't really be considered brother and sister. Wang chuckled and told his interlocutor that soon they would have to mark him. The boy looked down and replied that he regretted not being able to protect the girl when he was younger. And even though it will take him some time, he will help her take her destined place. Then silence fell. Servan looked at Hal, and he lowered his gaze to his sleeping sister. Now is the time for the fugitives to leave soon. Their pursuers will be back here. Hal carefully took the girl in his arms and, smiling, said that at least he had someone to protect. Servan calmly watched the unexpected guests leave the hut. He said goodbye with the words, "See you soon." Sunlight and birdsong woke the princess while Van prepared breakfast. First of all, the girl was interested in the question of where the children had gone. Van replied that their guests did not want to bother the travelers any longer and left at dawn. Adelia was surprised that Van disliked the boy, because he reminded her of Servan himself in childhood. The princess was clearly in a good mood and would be interested to know where this mysterious guest came from. Servan indifferently said that he didn't know, but that he was ready to ask him next time. The statement about next time surprised the girl, but Van was completely convinced of it. Because they would surely meet again. Servan's thoughts were occupied by the relationship between slaves and masters, which he intends to change. They continued their journey, only now the knight was riding a horse, and the girl was levitating. Thanks to his magical power, she didn't really like this situation, but there was no other option. Servan explained that as a Celagelian, he has great physical endurance, and my lady can rest peacefully. And not worry. Suddenly he stopped his horse, because finally the long-awaited view opened before them. This is Girton, a beautiful port city with houses in shades of blue. Adelia was delighted with the crowded place and enjoyed the ride, while her companion was worried that getting a pass would take a long time. And the lady would get tired again. Therefore, he was going to handle this matter on his own, and Milady reminded him of the mark. And besides, she didn't intend to part. And if he doesn't agree, he should at least get rid of the imposed mark, they wondered. However, at that moment, a third person intervened in the conversation. The man with long blue hair apologized and kindly offered his help. Adelia, of course, recognized this man as Huggy Crouch. She couldn't even believe her luck. Not only did she find him so quickly, but he also came to her. A malicious smile appeared on her face, and she happily accepted the offered help. To please Huey, it was necessary to pretend to be a child, and Adelia did it brilliantly. They walked together among the crowd. The blue-haired man was amazed by the courtesy of the cute child he met. He even wanted to pat Adelia's head, but then his faithful protector intervened. Huey quickly realized what was happening. He apologized and promised that the travelers could easily pass the checkpoint with him. He is local and, having traveled frequently, gets along well with the guards. Adelia, still standing behind her knight, courteously thanked her new acquaintance. Despite the scorching sun and the blue sky, Huey felt very cold. This behavior surprised the travelers. Adelia even thought he was crazy because it was hot outside. Meanwhile, Van decided to tell Milady that he would like to see the sea with her. Besides, when all this was over, Servan suggested going to fish. Adelia instantly accepted this proposal for a date in her opinion. Meanwhile, the travelers reached the checkpoint. Wei took them out of line and introduced them to the guards. However, he didn't expect what object his new acquaintance would use to identify him. It was the Gerard family ring, which greatly surprised Huey. The Gerard family is very famous. I wonder what these people can do here. Adelia thanked Huey for his help, and he suggested they definitely visit the Argel market. Footsteps of people were heard around. The princess decided to clarify that she and Servan had arrived to meet the head of the Gallon Corporation. Adelia even asked sarcastically if her interlocutor knew this man. And the naive Wei was so amazed that new acquaintances were looking for his brother. Of course, he immediately went in search of his twin. Finally, their efforts were crowned with success. A familiar voice called the young man. The head of the Gallon Corporation, Huggy Crouch, earnestly asked his brother not to shout like that anymore. Adelia's new acquaintance, with a radiant smile, reported that guests had arrived for her important brother. The princess politely introduced herself and said she wanted to invest in Gallon Corporation. Wei was surprised to have the opportunity to meet Lord Gerard's youngest daughter. He immediately began analyzing the information, realizing that in the vulnerable position of a newly established corporation. The investor usually takes over the corporation later, and Adelia immediately replied to his mental question that she was not going to do this. Huey still didn't believe that Adelia wouldn't take the wheel because his field of activity was unpopular. And the investment amount was too large. He also fears that if he refuses the offer, Gallon will suffer completely. Milady understands that with the current state of the project, it is difficult to make a decision. In his mind, Wei felt that he was right. Management was getting harder every day, so he warned that he could not return such a large amount too quickly. Adelia emphasized that with her proposal, she meant something different, and handed the interlocutor a brochure requiring investors for the study. Reading the surprise on his face, She said that it was indeed unexpected for a noble lady to be interested in food preservation research. But she liked the goal of the project because it would help reduce the number of deaths from spoiled food. The experiment was suspended because the nobles did not invest in it, because they already have magic. But Adelia is worried about the omnipresent hunger and wants to stop it. In the port city of Girton, many people wander around looking for discarded fish. And they eat rotten fish, and the story of the brothers was even more tragic. They were the sons of Baron Crouch, and they lost their parents and then their sister due to poisoning. This injury made the two brothers dream of becoming doctors and scientists. Still, the princess's goals did not convince Huey, because the lady was unlikely to eat spoiled fish. But Adelia didn't care about this. The head of the corporation got the idea that his sister would now be the same age as my lady. Gerard's youngest daughter was convincing with her words and asked to see the research results. The young men were able to contemplate a wonderful laboratory and library in one room. Adelia was surprised by how well everything was arranged here, and Crouch explained that this was only storage space, and that the research room itself was further away. The head of the corporation decided to immediately show the girl his first artifact. It looked very small. Next, the princess was able to see larger artifacts. Huey called them Prilla, and Adelia's face immediately darkened. She immediately remembered that this was the name of the late sister of the Crouch brothers. She smiled regretfully and asked if it was true that the name meant joy. Hugh noticed the truth of her words, despite her outward coldness. Deep down, he is a very sweet young man. At that moment, Wang made another discovery by himself and found artifacts whose structure seemed unusual to him. Crouch confirmed that this is the newest example and that it is also larger than all the others here. Adelia asked how often the researcher recharges the crystals, and Hugh replied regularly. If the stone is not damaged. The princess realized that if she herself recharged them so often, her mana supply would be at 0. She opened the box and, to her surprise, found a familiar plant there. Crouch explained that Rima was placed there to eliminate the odor, because if there is a lot of food in an enclosed space, it will absorb odors easily. Rima has a deodorizing effect. Elkarian became interested in this plant on Huey's recommendation. If you attract Crouch to you, the prince will lose his field, Rima and Gustia can gain. Adelia explained that the most important thing in this research was the magic stone. And the magic used to charge it, and the researcher confirmed that her words were true. Magic stones are easy to buy, but they are not charged with magic, and since Yagis are the senior staff, they are difficult to recruit. Continuous work is required to keep up with the progress of the research. And currently only Hugh himself is doing this, so the research is progressing slowly. Adelia clarified that if Crouch accepted her conditions, she would provide him with stones. And yakas every month. Hugh needs the stones right now and feels that the price will be too high. But my lady has an even better offer, which is that the entire Crouch organization moves to the Gerard family. These are very tempting conditions. But Hugh still wonders if he can leave his homeland when suddenly a roar is heard. It turned out that Van decided to try charging the stone. This process was surprisingly very noisy, although normally it shouldn't be the case at this level. Servan managed to fully charge the stone, although Crouch had previously lowered the charge to 0. This amazed the researcher. He turned to Delia, who already thought that Van had broken everything. Hugh was surprised that the Gerard people could restore magic several times a day, and still remain so calm. Adelia explained that she has other talented people, but she will not give up Van. Milady again offered Crouch a contract, while Servan continued to surprise him with the rapid recharging of magic stones. The agreement was signed. The Gerard family would help Huggy Crouch with the research, and he, in turn, would donate half of the artifacts and pay a tenth of the investment amount, or his younger brother, Ruth Crouch, would pay this amount. The satisfied young men walked down the street. Adelia was worried that Van was tired. The knight assured her the opposite. As always, the inspired princess offered to finish everything tomorrow because they couldn't stay here for long. when suddenly her leg got caught on a cobblestone. She stumbled and fell directly into the strong arms of her servant. Once Van was sure that Milady was fine, he immediately apologized so he could take the drastic step. In an instant, with one hand, he lifted the princess, and she found herself completely in his arms. Adelia was embarrassed and therefore a little mischievous, but Van was sure he was doing everything right. Because my lady was too pale. The princess was worried that Sir Van considered her a child, and this was too much. But he reminded her that my lady was the most important thing in his life. She resigned herself and accepted her position of powerlessness, and thus they moved on. The sunset gave way to the darkness of night. The youngest of the Crouches greeted the guests on their estate. Adelia was sleeping in Sir Van's arms, and the first thing she did was ask the owner of the house where the lady's bedroom was. Hugh tried to start a discreet conversation. He asked about Milady's age because he had a sister the same age, but Sir Van coldly replied that he had no right to reveal that information. Crouch was still fascinated by my lady's condition and asking if everything was all right with her. He brought his hand to her face. Needless to say, he received a lightning-fast slap on his impudent palm. He was hit by static electricity. Although he didn't even touch Adelia. They quickly dispersed. Sir Van sat in the room and looked at the wall. He thought about how he wanted to kill this blue-haired guy. My lady really needs it so much, this irritated Van. The darkness of night fell upon the harbor. There was not a soul on the pier. Adelia was angry with Sir Van because he wouldn't let her go fishing. The princess reasoned that her servant hated the smell of fish, although he tried to say otherwise. She gave reasons for this opinion, but he still argued with her. Milady sighed, unable to continue the argument, and Sir Van noticed that she had changed a lot. She looked at him surprised and asked what he meant, but Adelia began to feel embarrassed because their faces were now too close. Her heart beat like crazy, and she even started thinking that Sir Van had taken such a small boat to start bothering her. Although the young man seemed calm. But this is only from the outside. He realized himself that if my lady got 1 centimeter closer, he would be impressed. Even though he was the first to take the initiative. Sir Van exhaled heavily when suddenly, the uncomfortable intimate silence was broken by a jet of water. It was a fish pecking, and Adelia, skillfully hooking it, pulled it out. The girl's face lit up with a smile. She reached for the fish, but Sir Van did not allow the slippery body of the waterfowl to touch my lady's delicate skin. The lady was surprised that Van prepared a bucket of water to store the fish. And didn't use magic. In any case, the fish was caught, and the traveling couple swam back. A solitary boat, with people who were not alone, constantly sailed on the dark surface of the water. Sir Van's muscles tensed as he rowed. He looked concentrated and infinitely beautiful in the moonlight. Admiring the young man's appearance, the girl realized that she had stained her dress. So she frantically began taking it off, unconsciously attracting her companion's attention. The princess's hair fluttered in the wind. She tidied her dress shyly. And she looked incredible at the same time. Every movement of hers was imbued with tenderness and precision. Sir Van's cheeks blushed. He was ready to admire her forever. He suddenly decided to inform the princess that the path they were sailing was the only possible one. Adelia saw the servant's enchanted face and associated it with his love for nature. And the beach. Looking at his happy and embarrassed face, she herself involuntarily blushed. Encouraged by the experience of fishing together, the lady suggested that they go to the beach next time. Sir Van replied courteously, but with feeling that he would be happy to go to the beach together. His face lit up at the thought that they would have another chance to spend time together. The bright sun shone over the Gerard lands. Adelia was again worried about Sir Van's condition because he used too much magic. After traveling with the lady, Van became craftier, so instead of staying silent, he decided to answer. The young man cunningly said that since he was also human, he was of course a little tired. But overall he was fine. Adelia asked him to always be honest and noticed that the young man had chapped lips. So she invited him to transfer some of her magic to him. Sir Van was very embarrassed by this proposal, but at the same time, he really wanted to try. Although my lady was not sure if she could do it. The servant blushed even more, but the princess was serious and promised that she would definitely help him. She turned sharply and walked confidently forward, and when she noticed that Van hadn't moved, she took his hand. Adelia tightly took the knight's hand and, while he blushed with shame, she asked him never to run away. In the forge, the couple waited for the couple. Frightened to see Sir Van Hicks, there was literally horror in her eyes, as if she were looking at a monster. After a brief conversation, the blacksmith finally stood up and handed the result of his work into the lady's hands. And her servant, Adelia, told Sir Van that it was a gift for him and desperately wanted Van to open it as soon as possible. When the knight removed the cloth from the object, he froze in surprise. In front of him was a magnificent sword with a magic crystal in the hilt. The weapon looked incredible, and Van noticed that the sword was quite large, which caused a wave of indignation among the creator of this masterpiece. These words also moved Adelia, and she looked at him with puppy eyes. Sir Van had no weapons against this technique and accepted the size of the gift, but he was still tormented by obsessive thoughts. For the Earl's empire, other people were always considered inferior. So they were always slaves, even Yahai. Since the Yahai became the power of the country, nobles and royalty had to come up with another rule. Outstanding Yahai will receive the title of knight for a short period of time upon recommendation of a count or previous title. The Yahai are obliged to serve the person who recommended them, and these nobles can strip them of their title at any time. Even if they received the title of duke, they would still be looked down upon, and when they grew old and weakened, they would become slaves again, like animals imprisoned in an impenetrable wall. Sir Van was satisfied with the role of the lady's beast and promised that he would not protest. But why did he suddenly decide to move away from her? He really couldn't stay with her anymore. Milady did not understand the meaning of these words and asked what Sir Van meant. He explained that he could get a magic stone, but a sword was different. A sword engraved with the name of Haystack, the god of war, is not given to a slave. This type of sword will attract attention. It is very strange to others. People will misunderstand the princess's intentions. Earls granted a sword, engraved with the name of a god, to those who belonged to the other oppressed people. To follow Haystack means betraying again and creating Seligal. Adelia seriously asked the servant if he could do this. Sir Van was amazed by this question. He has no idea how to approach it. The girl looked at him and convincingly asked him not to stand behind her, but to be by her side. In a trembling voice, the knight again clarified whether the lady really wanted to leave him. The deepest regret and a premonition of the inevitable could be read in his eyes. Adelia lowered her head and confirmed the accuracy of his assumption and said she was sorry. For a moment, Sir Van felt a pain in his heart, but since he had no other choice, he humbly lowered his head. Then he felt that same feeling when they abandon you. Thoughts were spinning in his head. Why did he engrave the name of the god of war on the sword, which is what he really wants? Although he knows some things for sure. Sir Van swallowed the lump in his throat, drew the sword from its scabbard, and looking at his lover's determined face, he agreed. No matter what it is or why, he will follow her. Sir Van's room was illuminated by the setting sun. He wrapped his sword in a cloth and explained that the floor was very dirty. The princess was in a good mood, so she asked the servant to come closer and allowed him to transfer his magic to him. Sir Van was skeptical of this proposal and said that there was no need to take his hand. At the same time, he was very worried about whether the lady would be well during the process. She was determined and inspired and bravely took the young man's hand. And then, with a slight movement, she pulled him towards her so that the confused knight could not resist. Adelia firmly grabbed Sir Van's big hand and said that she would do it now. Her eyes shone, and her hands gently caressed his strong wrist. Sir Van could only admit to himself that he was truly worried. They sat on the bed facing each other. Adelia warned him that she could ask him to stop when she got tired. My lady's face was playful, but the young man's face was flushed with shame. She gently touched the back of the knight's hand with her lips. Servan seemed to be in a dream that vaguely filled his heart. His magical power overwhelmed the young man. He realized it was time to stop and called his lady. Adelia slowly raised her eyes, framed by thick pink eyelashes. After kissing his hand, she looked at Servan and said that his skin was too tough, so she couldn't apply her magic. So the lady suggested trying somewhere else. This was the first time she had seen so many emotions on Van's face, so she asked him if she should switch to his neck. Servan agreed, and Adelia quickly brought the knight's head close to her. She pressed her lips on the sensitive spot, and magical power poured into the young man's body. It seems my lady is giving away too much. Tiredness has vanished as if by hand, and I even wonder if the amount of innate magic can be surpassed. At some point, Van felt that he couldn't do it anymore. He gripped the sheet and asked Adelia to stop. He gently moved away from the girl, while she was frightened by his condition. The blush on Van's face mixed with sweat drops, and he asked Milady to stop there. The young man sat down, covering his embarrassed face with his palm, and Adelia decided to dot the i's. The sword and the magic she gave the servant do not mean she wants to abandon him, or that she wants him to leave. Adelia only wanted her knight not to be behind her, but by her side. Sitting on the bed opposite Serban, she said she wanted to help him return. And one day, when he returns, Adelia wants him to live with her. Van was stunned by such a declaration and could not believe what he heard. He could live with the lady. However, despite such a generous offer, the young man was clouded by other thoughts. After all, the day his mistress erases his mark will be the day he has to leave. Adelia still couldn't understand why he was so obsessed with this. There is absolutely nothing good about this mark, nor about his strange attitude. But there is nothing to be done. She agrees to listen to Van's words, because when it comes to him, she is very weak. He put his hand around Milady's hand, caressing his face, and promised that he would always be by her side. Adelia had no doubt that he would return, so she promised that she would always wait for him. Despite the darkness of the night outside the window, cheerful whistling could be heard in the castle. Adelia, happy, almost spun around the castle, when suddenly she was startled by a very annoyed butler. He said that his people had heard that His Highness, the Crown Prince, had not yet woken up. Therefore, messengers want to visit my lady to find out what happened, and although Adelia tried to laugh, she herself understood the gravity of the situation. In any case, this incident happened on the Gerard family estate, and it is even good that no messenger has arrived yet. On the other hand, there is good news. For example, Huey Crouch's team has already been transferred to the ship. Everything will be transported soon. These were all the important events of today, so the lady decided to take a break. However, the servant remembered another urgent piece of news. A letter arrived at the palace from the Count, Adelia's father, and she became sad because it happened so late. The butler handed the lady a letter in a white envelope with a red official seal. In the letter, the Margrave wrote that the plans had changed, and he would arrive a day earlier than expected. The message was moderate, but Adele's father wrote it, and the thought that he was still alive made my soul feel warm. Suddenly, a familiar voice was heard from behind. Servan came at Adelia's request, approached and stroked the servant's face, wondering if he was rested, and also promised that he would always treat Van well, so he shouldn't run after other girls. These words melted his heart. The young man, of course, was embarrassed. He turned around and changed the topic of conversation to a discussion about the garden. Adelia remembered that she really dreamed of a pond and a garden, but only because she felt lonely. Because she thought that, in this distant land, when she created a garden like other nobles, someone would come to visit her, even though she lives far away. But in reality, the lady was just wasting money and time waiting for this nonsense. Van decided to clarify if her words were sincere, to which Adelia replied affirmatively, and said that growing Rima was much better. In this place, she will build a training ground for the sick. This suits the Gerard family better than a flower garden. However, this will only be camouflage. Later, it will become a place to serve the military. After building this area, she will place magic stones on the ground so that it won't be cold in winter. And she will also order the surrounding buildings to be removed to prepare shelter for the army. While bandaging the uprooted plants, Adelia understood that this would indeed be better. Servan took her hand. He was still worried about this change, but my lady said she still liked the forest very much. And that sitting on the porch she could enjoy tea. In turn, the servant promised to plant a beautiful flower tree for the lady next time. She asked for it to be only one tree. She gathered her hair behind her ear and stood up. Servan looked at her as if bewitched. Only the thought that he wanted to bite her and swallow her spun in his head. Devouring her completely while she suffers, he will enjoy it. Van stood up and got to his feet. He looked paranoid and crazy. The young man approached my lady. She was looking at 2 bags. They were wormwood and peas, if you bury them deep in the ground and sow the seeds. They will grow well. Adelia said she read it in the book because she didn't want to mention that this was her knowledge from the future. With the help of magic, Van instantly buried all the fertilizers exactly according to the princess's instructions. And then they started planting the plants by hand. In childhood memories, Adelia didn't even notice how quickly Servan took care of his share of the plantings. She was very annoyed because he was in such a hurry since she wanted to spend more time together. However, at that moment, the one she had been waiting for arrived in the courtyard. In front of the girl stood a tall, handsome man with brown hair and violet eyes. It was her father. Not believing he was actually still alive, she threw herself into her beloved's arms. The bored girl was overwhelmed with feelings and burst into tears as the count apologized for making her wait so long. In the girl's head, there were only prayers that he would not die, that he would not leave her. But the lady calmed down and looked into her father's eyes. Adelia invited Dad to have tea. He smiled, nodded, and said it was a good idea. In the hall of the Gerard castle, Adelia poured tea for her father. The count took a sip and noticed that his daughter's skills in this matter had improved. But Adelia doesn't even drink tea, but sometimes it's nice to live such moments. The lady gathered her courage, stood up, and decided to tell her father what she was doing now. But he interrupted her and told her that he had already heard it himself. He knew about the blacksmith, the prince, and the trip for the Gallon Company, although he was surprised by Rima and. However, the count noticed that Adelia was already an adult. She had her own path. And he had no right to stop her. The girl was surprised, lowered her gaze, felt a note of indifference in his words. Adelia took a sip of her tea and wondered if her father had ever cared about her. However, the count decided to ask what his daughter thought about not being tied to the crown prince. Adelia replied that she had the same intentions, but feared that in that case she would not be respected. Unfortunately, the conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. In complete calm, the count asked who had come. Haley replied from the other side of the door, and Adelia realized that the messenger had arrived. On the other side of the tea table sits Duke Klimt, who greets the hosts with a blessing from Judith. Adelia thought this was a difficult person, although there had been no order from the emperor yet. In any case, this did not prevent Milady from serving bitter tea to the Duke and smiling sweetly at the same time. Referring to his clumsiness, after talking about tea, the Count finally asked directly what they owed for the arrival of such a guest. The Duke replied that he was literally in a desperate situation. His Majesty ordered him to come as an envoy, but he realized that he did not expect to find Kelsing Gerard here, because he was supposed to return tomorrow. It was difficult to embarrass the owner of the house. He said directly that the Duke himself wanted to come here. Clemson laughed sarcastically and pointed out that for a person far from the capital, Kelsing Gerard knows quite a lot. The Count deflected the dart and returned the dialogue to the true purpose of the Duke's visit. The guest crossed his legs and asked him not to rush because the older you get, the more uncertainty you have. Klimt reminded him that he was the grandfather of His Highness, the Crown Prince. The Count was surprised that such things could be discussed in private. But the Duke was too relaxed to fear this attack. The envoy decided not to torment him and tell him directly that he wanted Gerard's daughter to marry His Highness as soon as possible. This thought made Adelia uncomfortable, but her father remained calm. He put his teacup on the table, became serious, and turned to the Duke. But he pretended not to understand what his interlocutor meant. It was difficult to compete with the authoritarian Kelson Gerard, but Klimt did not back down. And he began to talk about my lady's age, because she is still young, which is why her father often avoids this conversation. Adelia herself was surprised that her father was even opposing this marriage now. After all, in the past, her father asked about her wishes. She simply agreed. And left it to fate, and then Van left. She thought she would never see him again, so the best option was to marry the prince. Although without love, she chose this path to alleviate her father's burden. However, she had never rejected the emperor's proposals before. I wonder why he is doing this time. Kelson Gerard explained that since ancient times, his family had faithfully served the empire and, therefore, they could not be united. The Duke decided to put pressure on Milady herself. He turned to her and told her that 19 is the right time to think about marriage. Adelia replied dryly that she had always been raised as a descendant of her family, so she should lead the Gerard family. Klimt began to get angry and argue that the prince was weak now, which meant that the emperor needed the Gerard family's help more than ever. But Kelson noticed that they never saw the decree. It became increasingly difficult for the Duke to maintain this dialogue. His interlocutor was invulnerable. And he even noticed the emperor's suspicious attitude towards His Highness. As heir to the imperial throne, he received no support. Although he is the eldest son, the prince's position is unstable, and furthermore, it is interesting that a lightning bolt struck precisely on Gerard's lands. That the Sin said he didn't want his daughter to live in the palace, monitoring her every word. And so if this is not included in the decree, he will speak personally with His Majesty. The Duke realized that it was better for the emperor not to know this information. Because the decree only spoke of conducting an investigation, so he asked to stay at the Gerard's house for a while to complete his work. And the owner of the house agreed courteously. However, Klimt was not going to completely abandon his plan. He decided to wait a little longer. He was also very irritated by the Count's arrogant attitude. The castle was plunged into the darkness of night. The silence was only broken in Lady Gerard's room. On the desk were the pages of a book, illuminated by moonlight. Adelia buried her face in the pillow and was indignant at the Duke's betrayal. Servan found her in this state, who, as usual, climbed through the window. She explained to him that the old man who came as a messenger was the prince's grandfather. And most likely, he used this as an excuse to blame Milady. However, it definitely wasn't her. Elcarian was simply unlucky to be struck by lightning. The prince has not woken up yet, and if he dies, things will be very bad. Then Servan simply offered to wake up His Highness. Wang said he had seen a similar case, which surprised the girl. She took his hand and pulled him towards her, asking him to finally finish what he had started. Adelia knows he will manage, but she is still worried about her healer. She pushed back his hair, exposing his neck, and a silent moan was heard in the room. Meanwhile, outside the castle, the silence was broken by the creak of a wooden door. The maid was catching her breath because she had just taken a sword from Van's room. However, she failed to go unnoticed. The owner of the room called her in a threatening voice. The girl fell from surprise. Servan bent down and picked up the sword, and then, in a heavy tone, accused the maid of stealing. In the context of the full moon, her eyes looked predatory and terrifying. The girl tried to convince herself that there was no reason to be afraid, that this boy was simply angry. And at the same time, she tried to justify herself by saying that she was only checking if everything was all right in the room. Servan held a sword wrapped in cloth in his hands. It turned out that the maid had no idea what this object was. She stood up and began to shake herself. She tried to act confidently, and then said that the sword simply seemed too suspicious. The formidable knight continued his questions in an impassive voice. The maid decided to play dumb, approached him, and pretended to be playful. She started a conversation about the relationship between Servan and the lady. She said she doubted them. And then she clung to his chest. Pretending to be in love and getting closer, whispering in a languid voice, She almost said why else she visited Van's room. Suddenly, a flash of lightning shone around her neck. A purple magic squeezed her throat. And the girl was suffocating. Tears sprang from her green eyes. The maid coughed and begged Servan to stop. However, he didn't care about her suffering at all. He started to guess. He began to suspect that the maid had done something to Adelia. The sun shone brightly over the Gerard lands again. Duke Klimt was informed of the girl's death. She slipped and fell and died. The emperor's envoy was worried that the count had guessed about the spy. Although in any case, they still didn't know who Grina was or what exactly she wanted to do. However, the duke was still angry. He chuckled and asked the servant if he had contacted Sonia about the magic stones. It seems a lot of money will have to be spent to find them. Furthermore, the servant asked if it was possible to conduct an investigation into the incident with the prince and the lady among the Celestial slaves. The duke immediately realized that perhaps Adelia had moved away from His Highness because of that slave. The servant confirmed the assumption and said that the young people met when the princess was 9 years old, and that the lady still pays a lot of attention to this slave. Despite there being no more rumors, it is necessary to reunite Adelia with the prince. Therefore, the duke will first have to meet with the head of the detachment. He ordered the servant to contact the count and invite him to dinner. Klimt left the Gerard castle, doubting that he was in a safe place. In the forge, Hicks waited for the lady to finally leave, because the foreman himself was a terribly lazy man. However, Servan suddenly appeared there, reminding the blacksmith that he had business to do. And since the young man was still very afraid of the lady's knight, he immediately ran away. A green leaf fell from a branch and fell right at Van's feet. Its appearance reminded the young man of the previous night. He could not understand the essence of this matter, because the Maiden of Gren actually knew nothing. Suddenly, not far away, a curse directed at some stupid animal was heard. A black and white cat was sleeping on the path between the trees, thus blocking the duke's way. The old man was beside himself with rage, and Van recognized Klimt, even from a considerable distance. At that moment, several thoughts crossed Servan's mind. Why did everything suddenly change? What was this sudden order? Perhaps these events are related to the sudden appearance of this old man, who is called the messenger. However, he is not the most powerful and deserves punishment for spoiling the lady's mood. But Servan remembered how carelessly he acted with the prince, so he must act more carefully. Suddenly, the sleeping cat opened its eyes wide, let out a terrifying roar, and assumed a threatening pose. Then the duke decided to deal with the animal himself. Cursing the cat, he pulled back the bowstring, preparing to shoot an arrow. The cat attacked first. It jumped onto the duke's horse, and he fell to the ground screaming. A breathless servant burst into the Gerard castle hall with urgent news. The news that Duke Klipmum had fallen off his horse reached the father and the daughter drinking tea. Very soon, the servants had already prepared a carriage for the journey of the emperor's ambassador. Adelia played her best role when she showed sympathy for the hated old man. She even managed to cry. Servan watched this performance and noticed that Milady's mood had finally improved. At that moment, the count approached him, addressing him by name. Van bowed, realizing that he was weak only in front of 2 people first. Of course, he would never kill the lady, and secondly, the person who let them meet. When the young man met Kelsing Gerard, he had no special feelings. At that moment, Servan was sold as a slave to fight. Looking at the boy, the count noticed that he had good eyes and took him with him, even though for the boy there was no difference between staying there or leaving with this man. And then the most fateful encounter in Servan's life took place. The little pink-haired girl immediately began asking him about his age and name. At that moment, the boy realized that this was the answer to all his questions. This is her, and now they are connected for life by the red thread of destiny. Thanks to the count, she was born, and thanks to him, Servan met her, so the young man is eternally grateful to his master. Kelsing Gerard said he needed to talk to Servan, so he invited him for tea. The young man was surprised by this proposal, but of course he agreed. On this sunny day, work was proceeding hard as usual outside the castle. Adelia barely reached this place, but even here she couldn't find Servan. One of the slaves noticed the lady and guest who she was looking for. The glare of the sun played with the interior of the castle. Adelia knocked on the count's office door, and he invited her in. The door creaked open. The girl entered the room, and the father immediately realized that she had come looking for that person. Kelsing looked serious as he sat and worked. However, he said he sent Servan back after the conversation. And Gerard also asked slyly if his daughter really cares more about some boy than her father. It seems Kelson had no intention of dedicating Adelia to the details of his conversation with Servan. However, the girl decided to ask if her father knew that Van liked her, to which she received an affirmative answer. Adelia's serious face gradually transformed into a gentle smile. She smiled even more and asked her father to invite him too next time so that the three of us could have tea. Adelia apologized, slammed the door shut, and ran away, leaving Kelsing lost in thought. Tears fell onto the workbench and the head of the family. Gerard prayed to God to forgive him. Night fell, and in her room, Adelia was also shedding tears onto her pillow. She couldn't find Van, and she feared that if she didn't find him today, they wouldn't see each other for the next 4 years. Of course, they will meet again before dawn, but they will have very little time. She left the most important thing for today because she hates saying to. And so, while voicing her regret into the pillow, a familiar voice called her. Sir Van had been on Adelia's balcony this whole time, and he didn't enter only because she didn't invite him in. Then the girl called Van, and he was surprised to see her tears until his gaze landed on the hiking backpack. The young man remembered that he had to leave today, so he tried to feign a smile, although inside him was the most painful wound in his heart. Adelia apologized, but Van regretfully recalled that he himself had chosen this path. The lady grabbed the knight by the neck and buried herself in his shoulder. With remnants of tears in her eyes, Adelia removed the mark from Van's skin, and he once again promised he would return. As he is just a pathetic child, he will return like a dog to be with his lady. Adelia looked at him, silently took a breath to finally say something very important. Placing her hand on his shoulder, she said she liked being Van. Van was melting before her eyes. The secrets he had hidden in his heart for so long became harder to keep. He took her hand and told her that Adelia was the only one, and that he always kept his love for her in his heart. The girl smiled and said that Van could call her by her name, and immediately pronounced this beloved name like a magic spell. Adelia stroked Sir Van's cheek and then said she didn't like removing the seal. But that today, they would leave completely different seals for each other. She ran her finger over the young man's lips, indicating that this place would be here. And he agreed. Adelia leaned back against Sir Van and kissed him passionately. At some point, Pan stopped, looked deeply into the princess's eyes, and asked if he could try himself. The girl smiled and nodded. Then the young man stood up, and they switched places. In this touching moment, Sir Van expressed another request. He wants to leave a piece of himself on the lady, and also wants her to do the same. And then his fingers squeezed tighter. Adelia groaned softly. Outside my lady's bedroom window, it was already dawning. An annoyed servant sat down and apologized to his lover for exhausting her with a large amount of transferred magical power. The lady really felt well and was filled with happiness. Wang gave the lady final instructions, such as not eating too much ice when it's hot, not going out on a windy day, and taking care of her health. Adelia also asked Sir Van not to allow himself to be hurt or get sick. The young man was worried about not catching the man who was going to kill her, and the memories of his encounter with Count Gerard were also spinning in his head. He clearly pressured Sir Van as if he had already made this decision. The young man exhaled deeply and gathered the courage to ask the lady if she could stay with him when he returned. Adelia replied that Van's place was with her forever, and these words moved him, promising himself that he would return anyway. The girl sat on soft pillows in a relaxed position. Her speech was no longer sad, and a smile shone on her face. She said that no matter how soon Wang returned, she would always be waiting for him. A crackling sound is heard in the sky. The trees burn in black smoke. The The green-eyed young man wonders where the fire came from. There are lifeless soldiers in blue uniforms lying around, and Servan is behaving very strangely. And the blonde boy is trying to figure out if this is related to that person. It turns out that the reason for Wang's anger was the princess's handkerchief, which was completely stained with blood. And it seems that this slave and noble have an unusual relationship. The green-eyed soldier is even more concerned about how long Servan is going to refuse the crown prince's request. Because this could become a big problem, and the excuse of age no longer works. The young man thought that shackles didn't suit him. He loved freedom more, but Van was clearly different. Not like everyone else. And it's even strange that he can fall in love with someone, because the aura of the Selagilian is plagued with thorns. When Servan got up to leave, the soldier directly asked if that person was the reason for the refusal, since the relationship between Earls and Elaine was tense. At that moment, a third person intervened in the conversation, pointing out that the rejection of a request because of Adelia Gerard was really interesting. In front of his colleagues stood a red-haired young man, His Majesty the Crown Prince. Servan bowed and greeted the Crown Prince with Judith's blessing. His Highness was in a good mood, and noticed that the young man probably knew what question he had come with. And although the tone of the real person was humorous, Sir Van remained calm and serious. The prince said he had put a lot of effort into this matter, which means it is at least worth listening to. This time, Van did not resist and agreed to talk, which pleased His Highness, who had long wished to have a drink with the soldier. The crunch of snow in the winter forest is heard, and a pink-haired lady breaks the silence. Her face is as beautiful as before, but there is no carelessness in her eyes, only echoes of melancholy and sadness. Such an image is shown by a pink magic crystal, and Servan asks the prince what was written on that piece of paper. The interlocutor replies that it was news of that girl's engagement. It has not yet been made public. So even the prince found it hard to understand her. Adelia Gerard is negotiating an engagement with the crown prince of Aeolic Alcarion, who courts her unilaterally, but the duke and his arrogant daughter are not inclined towards him. But no one can know how long this will last. Duke Steerclimp is a greedy man. Having made his daughter the crown prince's concubine, he will become the emperor's father-in-law. The moment the baby grows up and becomes empress, Adelia Gerard will say goodbye to life. This is inevitable, and the crown prince regrets Servan's love. He did not harm his empire by falling in love with Adelia, but those people wanted to hurt her. And Servan's enemy is now the Earl's empire. It is very important to note that this is Earl's, not Elaine. Servan severely asked why he should trust the crown prince, which offended him greatly. Furthermore, the soldier set the condition that if he did not hear irrefutable evidence, he would simply leave this place. If he really wants to escape, neither the thousands of people around him nor His Highness himself will be able to stop the fugitive. The prince was annoyed that this was true, because Servan is a very strong Selagilian. An incredible talent, and the crown prince spent years trying to get this man. He exhaled deeply and agreed. Van worked so hard without rest that people nicknamed him the devil. Serban did not agree with these words. He would rather call himself Haystack, the god of war. It was a deep and quiet night over the camp. Van once again turned the magic stone to see his lover's face. How he wished she could answer whether he was doing the right thing for his lady. He reached out to the bright image and stroked the princess's cheek for some reason. She looked exhausted, perhaps tired. The words that she would always wait for him spun in his head. After turning off the light projection, Servan fell helplessly to the floor. He put his hands on his head and only hoped that Adelia was safe. With a flushed face, a lump in his throat, Van missed his beloved terribly. Adelia looked out the window. The weather was cold and cloudy. Dark clouds were throwing snow. Kelsing Gerard was playing chess with his daughter and noticed that her thoughts were not with him at that moment. The night sky really reminded him of Van. He wondered what he looked like now. How old he would be. Father and daughter became very close. Lately, they spent their free time together and discussed various topics. Although it seems that it has already become quite late, and the time has come to leave. Adelia kissed her father on the cheek, said good night, and left. As soon as the door closed, Kelsing coughed violently, holding the cough in his hand. And then, when the attack ended, I saw blood on my palm. Kelsing Gerard died one day, and then the fairy came to look for him and said she would listen to his wish. And his daughter's wish. Because caring for people and protecting them is the destiny, as well as the mission entrusted to the Gerards, whose veins run with fairy blood. For the Gerards, only one opportunity presents itself when they face betrayal from the people. The fairy promised to grant the wish, but Kelsing would not have the opportunity to observe or interfere. He simply wouldn't be there. And if this is the price to pay, then the head of the family, Gerard, gladly agrees to accept it. Tears ran down the fairy's cheeks as she heard the wish of her descendant, and swore to fulfill it. Sometime later, on November 8, 1111, a war broke out between Earlys and Elaine. Elcarian tried to send Kelsing Gerard to the battlefield, but could not. Because Kelsing was dying within the walls of his castle, wishing only to see his daughter held tightly by her lover's hand. This would be too good, but the fairy's oath that the wish would come true still echoed in my head. The dying count spoke of his love for his daughter as she burst into tears beside his bed. She wrapped her hand around his, as Kelsing promised Adelia that she would definitely be happy. On November 11, 1111, Kelsing Gerard fell into an eternal sleep. Difficulties awaited Adelia. She burst into tears near her father's bed. But he does not regret having disappeared from his daughter's life. Time flew by again. On December 6, 1111, the Gerard lands fell into the hands of Elaine. During the last millennium, a powerful magic was lost, and until now, no one has crossed the gates of Gerard. The commander of Elaine's army, Sir Van Haystack, walked confidently toward victory with a magic sword in his hands. A butler bursts into Adelia's room and reports that Elaine's soldiers have entered the capital, and they need to escape urgently. The princess was calm. She had no intention of leaving this place. She was wrong from the start. The lady continued sewing and noticed that none of the Gerards had died. She looked at the portraits of the great ancestors and thought that maybe Wang had not allowed it. But the truth is that even in her mind, there was a small doubt. Her father's death changed everything, if everything could be the same again. Adelia only wanted to give Van a feeling of comfort here, so she made a shirt. She stood up and walked to the door, asking when the night would finally return. The princess pulled the handle with the thought that if Servan himself did not come to her, she would come to him. The butler ran with all his might down the castle corridor, but was still caught and pressed hard to the floor by men in red uniforms. The servant was indignant. He looked at the army commander and asked how Servan could treat the Gerards like this. Van walked to the door, repeating the last dialogue with Adelia in his head, and regretting having to appear in front of her like this. He dared not open the door, while his green-eyed companion was amazed by the commander's indecision. And besides, for some reason, he asked if he could smell blood. Servan explained that Milady didn't like the smell of blood and that it would be better to wash first. But the soldier tried to calm him down by telling him that it didn't smell. Suddenly, the green-eyed young man had a memory in which he once found Servan with a strange flower. The plant was protected by magic, so when he tried to touch it, the soldier's hand was thrown back. Servan touched the flower very carefully. Nostalgia burned in his eyes. No ordinary cruelty was seen in them, and the reason was this bud. The soldier remembered this flower, now only because he saw something amazing. In reality, the flower looked exactly like her. Servan froze with mixed feelings because Adelia was in front of him. She ran to him and hugged him tightly. Looking at Servan, the lady noticed with a smile that the night had grown taller than before. Outside it was deep night. The faint illumination of the castle was reinforced by the moonlight. Van knelt on one knee in front of his lady. He stroked Adelia's cheek and noticed that his lover's face had become thinner. But he noticed the same thing in her. The princess herself said she was fine, but Servan knew that her father had recently left the girl, and most likely she had suffered a lot. He also noticed that the lady was standing barefoot on the cold stone of the hallway. In such inclement weather, and even with a thin shirt, so he immediately lifted her and carried her to the room. There he lit the fireplace so that my lady would not catch a cold. For some time, there was silence between the young people, until Servan gathered the strength to apologize to the lady for betraying the Gerards. And her lady. Adelia was perplexed and asked if Van really killed the Gerard people on the way here and destroyed their castle. This was an unexpected question for the night, and my lady asked Van to come closer. She reminded Van that all he had to do was simply return to her. And so he did. The army commander was still surprised that Adelia didn't curse him, didn't blame him or burn with hatred. She thought about it and said that although she was the heir to the Gerards, she had never liked Earls and, comparing countries, she would prefer Elaine. Moreover, she is even grateful to the knight for the destruction of this land, because now Adelia can finally escape the boring Earls. But Servan was even more surprised when the princess said that even if she could love this country, she would not hate Van because she loves him. The knight blushed completely and was speechless, and Adelia offered to kiss him if he wanted. And then she took my hand, pulled him toward her, and said with a smile that she could give me something even better. The carefully arranged books on the tea table, the numerous chandeliers, and pictures in the room enjoyed peace and quiet. Adelia opened her eyes, her hair was disheveled and her head was throbbing. Sitting on the bed, she tried to determine if it was day or night, and besides, it was unclear where Van was. The knight was kneeling by her bed at that moment, and this position surprised the girl. There was regret in his eyes. He told my lady that she had a fever. Adelia touched his forehead and realized that her throat also hurt. Moments from the last night surfaced in my memory, where, in a fit of passion, the princess whispered in the knight's ear that she couldn't restrain herself. After all, both he and she want this, and then there were gentle caresses. Now Servan sat and regretted deeply, although Adelia tried to calm him down. She has long known that she has a fragile body, and Wang conveyed the doctor's advice to take medicine immediately after eating. It turned out that the girl slept all day, and after clarifying her condition, she decided to find out what was happening to the Gerard people. To which Servan replied, with greater regret, that they were in custody. They were simply disarmed and their magic stones taken away, but their servants were treated humanely. This pleased Adelia, and she asked Van to finally get up. She also said she wanted to talk to her people and release those who would not follow the same path with her. But the knight was less careless. After all, among the people who are more loyal to the Gerards than to Earls, there may still be dangerous people, and Servan would like to put magic shackles on them so that the lady is not in danger. Although most likely, she will not agree to control people with magic. Then Servan will have to do this behind her back. Imposing shackles will easily solve the problems. But you cannot mention this in front of the lady. At that moment, Adelia herself said that magic shackles should be placed on the remaining people. And Van did not believe what he heard. The princess realized with regret that in such a situation it was easy to find a spy. Servan shared his feelings and simply remained silent, lowering his gaze. And then he said that if this happens, he will not forgive anyone. No one will dare to betray the lady. Adelia smiled and replied that this was wonderful, but now she wanted to hear something else. She suggested that Servan call her by the short form of her name, Ada, because that is how he should address her. But Servan was very embarrassed. Scratching the back of his neck a little, he gathered the courage and timidly uttered the hellish name. Adelia got excited and asked him to stop calling her that anymore. Suddenly, the lovers' cooing was interrupted by a knock on the door. The young people definitely didn't expect anyone, so Adelia was surprised. And Servan became cautious. They called the commander from the other side of the door. A greenish-haired young man entered the room. His face seemed familiar to Adelia. It seems she saw him even before her rebirth. He always looked at her like that. I wonder what his name will be. At that moment, the young man turned to Milady and told her that it was a great honor for him to meet the princess. He approached, bowed, and introduced himself as an advisor to the commander named Ugel. Servan suddenly became furious, and the young man did not understand what he had done wrong because he was only trying to be polite. Adelia asked Van to calm down, and she herself noticed that she hadn't expected her knight to have an advisor. Sir Van sulked at the advisor's words that he often had the wrong opinion or made wrong decisions. The princess noticed that her knight's problems were precisely because of her. Because most likely Van wouldn't allow soldiers into the castle, and they were freezing outside. So she took out a detailed design of thousands of tents that could withstand a snowstorm from the drawer of her nightstand, and places with the necessary medical equipment. The commander's advisor was amazed by such preparation, and Adelia was only glad that her work was not in vain. Ujul was already amazed by the solution to the problems on the part of the young lady. But Adelia surprised him even more when she said that she was actually older than Sir Van. The ladies' room was cozy and quiet, only the lovers' cooing could be heard. Adelia stroked Sir Van's face, reminding him that he had promised to punish them, and kept calling the lady. The princess said that if he called her by her name, she would allow herself to be kissed. The name of his beloved came from Van's lips twice, and he moved closer to her face. With a gentle movement, he laid her back on the bed, and he ended up on top, squeezing her hand with his. And so, when the lovers' lips finally touched, there was a third person in the room. It was a maid who came with lunch for my lady. She asked with a little contempt to be called when the lady regained consciousness. She turned around and remained absolutely impassive. The maid's name was Jessie. Before her rebirth, Van sent her with Adelia, and Milady herself was beside herself because the girl was attached to Van, without even being a Gerard person. Out of jealousy, Adelia was unfriendly to the maid. And if you think about it now, it seems she was sent here to protect the lady. Jessie has more wounds on her hands than all the other maids. The lovers talked a little more about the maid, and Van drew attention to the lunch they had brought. He fed the lady with a spoon, and she indulged in memories of her childhood. When Sir Van also gave her soup during her illness, Adelia smiled tenderly. She looked at Sir Van and said she loved him. The young man's eyes shone, his face lit up with a smile, and he replied in the same way. She looked at him tenderly, remembering that in the past Van had died for her. He saved her from death by poisoning. Then El Carrion, who had the antidote, wanted Van to drink the poison in exchange for the medicine. Now Adelia needs to figure out where she was poisoned. Then even a cup of tea passed through Van's hands. If it wasn't food, what was it? After feeding the girl, Sir Van got up and tenderly kissed her forehead. Adelia asked the knight to do this more often, because they are lovers. All this reminded Van of his childhood. No matter how sick the lady was, to the count who was in foreign lands, it was difficult for him to return home immediately, and in those moments she cried for her servant. At that moment, Sir Van reminded Adelia of her father, and he was embarrassed. So he decided to warn her that not only cold medicine was prepared for the lady. It was difficult for him to talk about the second cure for something the princess would like to prevent. For example, she understood everything and decided to say that children are the greatest blessing for parents, and that she would be happy if they came to them too. This would be the greatest joy. Adelia spoke of it sincerely, and Sir Van was spellbound. Then he smiled and moved closer to her. Sitting on the bed next to my lady, he hugged her from behind and kissed her neck. Because he chose the gentlest medicine, but still feared it might harm her. After that, Adelia said she wanted to take a nap and then go meet her people. The girl fell asleep quickly. Sir Van looked at his sleeping, beloved, and involuntarily recalled the conversation that took place 4 years ago. Kelsing Gerard then sat opposite a cup of tea and said that Sir Van needed to leave. Van, of course, was saddened by these words. He tried to find out the reason, and the count replied that the servant's abilities were not enough. Sir Van is like a chick that hasn't hatched from an egg. Now this burden is unbearable for him. Exorbitant strength only brings destruction. The young man was surprised that the Lord really knew who he was. The Duke spoke of the choice between the abyss and paradise that were waiting. And right now they are at a crossroads. The word "we" caught Van's attention, and apparently Kelsing Gerard really knows what it is. This was true, But this knowledge brought no joy to the Count, and Servan agreed with him. Something that should not have come to life found breath. This is truly terrifying. The owner of the castle sighed deeply, stood up, and walked towards Servan to pat him on the head. Knowing that it was Servan, he also felt relief. Van looked closely at his master. He seemed strange and very similar to Adelia. The knight lowered his head and noticed that there were many contradictions in Kelsing's speeches. Count Gerard, standing by the window, called Van. When the young man approached, Kelsing took his hand in his and noticed that the servant's hands were already larger than his own. One day, with these hands, Servan will have to take care of everything. Now the army commander understands that those words were related to Adelia's safety. Last night, he checked to make sure there were no traces of magic or curses on her body. Just in case, the doctor even checked the lady for poisoning. But her blood turned out to be pure. Suddenly, Servan was called. He had to go solve the problems. He covered Ada better and quietly left the room. Moonlight entered Adelia's room through the open curtains. The princess opened her eyes and tried to find Van. She didn't even have the strength to get up on her own, but a maid helped her in this, who said that the commander was not there. Adelia pretended to see the maid for the first time, so she had to introduce herself, and also said that most likely Servan was now in the middle of a war. The commander went into battle, and these words echoed in Ada's head. Milady immediately became sad. The maid realized this and decided to cheer her up. She approached the lady and told her that the commander had never been fatally wounded. Of course, it was a battle. He couldn't avoid minor injuries, but there was never a situation where he was between life and death. Therefore, the lady has nothing to worry about. Moreover, no matter how stingy the commander is with emotions, he would not want to see his beloved like this. Looking directly at Milady's pale face, the maid said that the commander protected her above all else. Adelia knew this. Van then drank the poison from Gavekin and died instantly. But she didn't. These memories gave the girl determination. She must do everything possible to find out about the sender before Servan arrives. She ordered the maid to call all the people who are imprisoned. The lady is going to know their opinion. Adelia stood in front of a noisy crowd, took the magic stone, and extended the magic field. In an authoritative voice, she announced that Gerard's land belongs to Elaine. There was immediate outrage in the crowd. She was accused of betraying her own country. Adelia explained that she is not forcing anyone and wants to give her people the right to choose. And as a daughter of Gerard, she declares the right to choose between earls and Gerard. The people were surprised. The recently noisy crowd fell silent. Adelia waited and thought that if they joined, it would help her, but even if they left, there wouldn't be much harm. She didn't intend to seduce anyone with speeches, and at that moment, a young man stepped out of the crowd, reminding her that a knight is a lord's weapon. Knights do not ask what path the lord will choose, because the lady is their path. The young men declared that they were born and raised in Gerard. Their oath belongs to my lady, so they will always follow her. Adelia announced that all who agreed to stay would be strictly controlled if the knights would want to follow her after this. Kneeling, the young men said they would think they deserved it. Obedient and loyal knights were announced that they had been chosen. Adelia cannot say that they will not regret their choice, but at least she will do her best. And she will not pursue them either if they return to earls, and will even raise funds for their residence there. Because she forces no one. Bright lanterns fought against the darkness of the night, and the crowd remained silent. Jessie approached the apparently annoyed mistress. Adelia honestly admitted that she had made many mistakes, and that she should be kind to those who stayed, including Van. The princess looked at the maid with a smile, approached, took her hand, and then said that she had become her exclusive maid. Then she kissed Jessie's wounded hand and offered to become her man, not Van's. Even Jessie's ears turned red. She felt spellbound, and Adelia thought about the trouble she had caused Van when she left Earl's people. The faithful maid reassured the lady by saying that the commander is a reliable person, and that His Highness Ekargan trusts him a lot. Although this may not be entirely reliable, in any case the commander always diligently prepares for everything except what has to do with the lady. The maid threw a cloak over my lady, trying to comprehend what feelings were experienced when his fingers touched her. Jessie took the lady to the bedroom and laid her down, wishing her good night. When the maid left, Adelia sat on the bed and reached for the nightstand. She took a document out of the top drawer, looked at it thoughtfully, and prepared to go somewhere. Near the castle gates, snow crunched under the horses' hooves. And Yugal rushed nearby. Servan, dressed in a dark cloak, asked the assistant not to worry. He came here alone. The commander's advisor literally shouted in surprise. He didn't understand how Servan could be so indifferent. When the commander disappeared, Yujil wanted to run after him, but the maid's hand was on the young man's shoulder, and came to ask him if he had ever been madly in love. He started making excuses, saying he didn't have time for this. He was very busy. Jessie sighed indifferently and let the young man go, lamenting that she still had to take care of his stupid clothes. Realizing embarrassedly that the maid worked hard, Yujil left, and the maid was left with the thought that she would have to try to get what she didn't have. She looked sadly at the figure of the commander's advisor walking away. In Adelia's room, Servan laid the sleeping girl on the bed and then covered her with a blanket. At night, he found her asleep at her desk, surrounded by a pile of papers. She probably spent a long time reading the documents and was very tired. Servan stroked Adelia's cheek, hoping she wasn't endangering herself. Tears fell from his eyes onto the girl's cheeks. He leaned over the lady and whispered her name. In the morning, Jessie came to say good morning to Adelia and found Servan asleep. Milady said she found him sleeping next to her. When she woke up, the maid looked at him with a cold note of condemnation. She saw that Van was only pretending to be asleep, but he opened his eyes slightly, and there was a threat in his gaze. God forbid Jessie told Adelia about this. The maid told my lady that the knight returned yesterday early in the morning at dawn, and must have been very tired. So as not to wake Van, Adelia decided to wash in another room and called Jessie with her. When my lady left, the maid stared at the sleeping man. He opened his eyes and showed with his whole appearance that he was very angry. Adelia and Jessie cooked an incredible steak. My lady was delighted, and the maid noticed that she couldn't do that at 23, accidentally letting slip that she knew the lady's real age. She had to say she heard this from the commander, and the lady began to ask how often Servan talked about her. And since when did they know each other? Jessie replied that she had known the commander for about 2.5 years and really wanted to repay his kindness towards her, which surprised Adelia. And then she caught the maid's embarrassed gaze and thought that she knew, but simply couldn't remember. The girls walked down the castle corridor. Jessie carried a cart with a dish, and Adelia walked next to her, wondering if Van had already gotten up. Milady looked forward to the meeting and really hoped that he would like the dish she had prepared. And Jessie thought about how jealous she was of the commander. She would really like to be able to receive the lady's sincere touches and her radiant smile. The only question in Jessie's mind was what she had done to deserve her. Indeed, Servan had already woken up and was delighted with the breakfast served. He showered Adele with praise, but Jessica couldn't watch the lovers cooing and left. Van was enjoying the steak and invited the lady to try it too, when the wonderful atmosphere was interrupted by shouting and stomping outside the door. Adelia was already furious when the butler burst into the room with a message about the arrival of a guest. My lady was surprised that this man came from Sonia, a neutral land that rarely has contact with other countries. Under the dark cloak, apparently, an old acquaintance was hiding. The young man took off his hood, smoothed his hair, and Adelia recognized the blue-eyed young man. Memories of how she smeared an ointment on his wounds surfaced in her head. It is surprising that Hal arrived at Gerard at this time. He smoothed his hair and suggested they move to the living room where tea and desserts were already waiting for them. The dark-haired girl apologized for being rude. Adelia was very interested in knowing who her guests were today from a closed country. So the butler led them to the living room. Then he realized that Hal was not alone with him. A travel companion had arrived with a cloak. From behind, Adele could not see the second alien. But now she sees a young woman in front of her. It seems Hal called her beautiful. Now they exchanged jokes, and Adelia asked to get down to business if it was urgent. But Servan clearly did not like his brother, and his sister showed displeasure with his whole appearance, while Hal remained sincerely calm and friendly. Adelia decided to clarify to the commander why he didn't seem too cheerful. To which Servan mysteriously replied that he should not underestimate the guest. In a whisper, he said that the king had recently changed in Sanya, but Hal also heard these words and corrected the lady's judgment, saying that it was not a riot, but only some things fell into place. He called it a revolution, and Adelia immediately realized that Hal was directly involved in this. Now my lady was even more worried about the question of why the guests came to her, and asked her to tell the truth this time. The dark-haired girl introduced herself by the name Biliata Sanya, and moreover, she recently holds the title of Queen of Sanya. He also gave his full name. It sounds like Kalos Sanya. He belongs to the royal family, but is only a faithful servant of His Majesty. A counselor. Adelia was amazed by this situation, and a little surprised that Halos was not the king. Moreover, if even the emperor did not see this, why did they reveal their identities? And to this question, Hal replied that it was gratitude. Milady, of course, did not believe that such a trip was made only for words of gratitude. So she seriously asked if the royal visit was related to the battle. Servan answered this question believing it was so, and a strange smile appeared on Halo's face. The last king rejected Gerard's offer. He is simply a coward who avoided direct trade and did not want to listen to anyone. Adelia noticed that now that Gerard has sided with Elaine, it will not be easy to obtain magic stones. Halos looked at his sister and nodded approvingly as she began to speak. Beliata warned that she would not ask why Gerard needed so many stones. Then she handed Adelia a contract for direct trade with Gerard, and my lady began to study the papers. Milady replied indifferently that these were terms of the deal too favorable, that many people would like to conclude such a contract with Sanya. And Hal explained that these stones were found in the mines by His Majesty. He found them on his lands so that he could dispose of them as he wished. To Adelia this seemed like boasting. Kalos continued, "Will it be between Sanya and Gerard, and between the two of them? So there will be no difficulties." The lady still looked at the guest with distrust, although Van assured her that such people could be trusted. It is impossible for an ordinary girl to simply stumble upon a stone mine. Feeling that the energy of a precious stone found deep underground is beyond the power of ordinary people. Perhaps Hal had already found the minerals and given them to Beliata as collateral. The embarrassed dark-haired queen replied that everything was a coincidence, and that now she was happy to be able to repay the lady for saving her life and helping Hal. She smiled sincerely, and once again clarified that she wanted to thank Adelia from the bottom of her heart. Milady sat with the contract in her hands and an emotionless expression on her face until Hull took it away, turning it into a joke about the poor palace. Then Adelia agreed with Sanya and received a large amount of magic stones, boxes full of purple crystals that shone in the sun. In return, the guests received the cost of their stay and were happy, while Servan suspected something suspicious. It was hard to believe that Beliata, by a stroke of luck, had suddenly become the richest queen ever. And while Adelia looked at the colorful stones, Servan looked at her. The girl turned to him and directly asked why he had been so strange lately. He replied that even if he didn't think about it, he was still attracted by the sight of my lady. All his thoughts are occupied only with Adelia. He is definitely hooked. The princess remembered that Servan liked it, and he replied that he was so in love that he was about to cry. At that touching moment, a deafening explosion occurred in the palace. The couple was almost thrown back by the shockwave. Servan. First, he protected Milady with a magic shield. After this, he ordered the soldiers to immediately move the injured to the west building. Then he ordered William to be called to transfer the matters to him. And only now did he turn back to Milady. She grabbed his hand. His skin was icy cold, but the knight insisted that everything was fine for him. Ashamed, he reminded Adelia that she told him not to get hurt, so he tried not to get hurt. 4 years ago, upon hearing those words, she held back her tears and smiled as she let him go. And those words are still in her heart. Adelia lowered her head silently, and only now realized that Huey and Hicks were lying on the floor next to them. It seemed they were conducting some kind of experiment. The lady ordered them to get up, and Huey dared to do it first. The researcher reminded the lady that they were developing a new weapon, and that anything could happen. And Adelia replied that this had already happened with the forge. Adelia was furious, but Huey and Higgs unanimously insisted that they had almost succeeded, and that the result was worth it. Milady didn't want to listen, but the experimental researchers persuaded her to look at the new invention. Huey explained that although it wasn't completely finished yet, he thought that the lady and the commander could take a look. He convinced them that this time they could trust him. Trying to calm down, Adelia remembered that Huey said exactly the same thing last time, and they agreed that it would be the last. Today ended with 20 soldiers injured, so what could happen next time? The researchers lowered their heads in shame, and Servin asked if they were really making shields. This interested him greatly, and he expressed a friendly desire to see the results of the work. Adelia melted at these words, smiled, and offered to go look together. Then, Wei stood next to the wooden box and explained that the pallets they used to make the shields simply destroyed the AI magic. There was extinction magic in the shield. But he and Hicks discovered something more. You could absorb attack magic with a gem in the center, and then release it directly at the enemy. And to test the effectiveness of such a weapon with protection, a test subject was chosen. It turned out to be a green-eyed soldier. The deputy commander was placed under a magic dome and did not like the idea. Wei clarified that William can send attack magic, no matter how long he touches this shield. The green-eyed test subject exhaled heavily, raised his sword, imbued it with magic, and swung it hard. Adelia watched what was happening and noticed the enormous firepower of the deputy commander. The magic was absorbed by the shield and then released with the same force. Wei and Hicks were happy that the experiment was completed successfully. And Adelia had a logical question about why that explosion occurred at that moment. The white-haired researcher suggested that there is a limit to the magic the shield can absorb in past experiences. With several simultaneous or stronger attacks, the shield emitted a sharp sound. So there is a possibility that if the amount of magic is increased, everything will explode even on the battlefield. It seems that the stone will definitely withstand 3 hits, and to encounter an enemy in war. This is already something. While the researchers and Adelia were discussing this, the commander slowly walked towards the protective dome. Milady worried and looked inquiringly at Van, but he paid no attention and had already walked directly towards William. He pulled the green-eyed soldier out of the dome and disappeared into the purple haze. There was determination in his eyes, mixed with regret. He approached the magic shield and pressed hard in the center where the crystal was located. Adelia screamed in horror and tried to stop Servin, but he paid her no attention. A loud crackling sound was heard. The place filled with a bright light. The lady kept screaming her beloved's name. Van continued to stand surrounded by a purple beam. Adelia ran towards the magic dome, but William stopped her, saying it was too dangerous. Everyone around her was frozen. The lady couldn't understand why he was doing this, and Van's experiment seemed unsuccessful. He stopped, looked around, and looked at the shield. It was all cracked, including the magic stone. The bewildered servant approached the crowd and apologized. Adelia exhaled heavily, lowered her head, the tension gradually left her, and then she became angry. And she shouted at Van, accusing him of being reckless. He apologized and assured the lady that he was trying to be careful, but then Crouch intervened in the conversation. The researcher regretted not having thought of building a shield, and he shouldn't have thought that it would help. Huey took all the blame. Higgs joined the apologies, but Adelia forgave them because they didn't do it on purpose. Being curious is not bad, but in the future, they must be more careful when doing something super dangerous. The researchers promised to do something more useful next time. The princess said goodbye and moved on, and Servin cast a threatening look at Higgs. And Huey, He seriously asked them to do their best, so that next time the shield could withstand the strength of one person. Then the commander and the lady left, leaving the researchers confused. Hui looked at the cracked shield and realized that Servan was undoubtedly very strong. While Van followed the lady, the other soldiers only whispered. The commander realized that he was a real monster and never allowed Adelia to find out about this. He didn't want her to find out. Meanwhile, night fell over the castle. Its walls were flooded with the blue moonlight. The lamps were lit in Adelia's room. The girl asked why Servan did this. He replied that it was no big deal, but he thought it was better to stop everything, given the effect it was having. Adelia noticed that all this could have gone wrong if it had been used during a riot. And at that moment, she herself was thinking about the weapon she had created. It was unusual to use something like this during a war. She wasn't worried at all. Servan, as if reading her thoughts, said that the weapon he had improved should be fine. There is no reason, and besides, there is a power limitation, and only magic can be used. Adelia was surprised by these thoughts and confirmed that they were correct. At the same time, she cheered up a little and decided to give Servan a gift. It was pajamas consisting of a t-shirt and trousers. They are light and will be comfortable for sleeping. Adelia looked directly into Van's eyes and noticed his taciturnity, but at the same time, she is willing to compensate him with her speech. Servan mainly wears the Elaine uniform, and he also uses magic, so he doesn't need armor. Not even blood appeared on the colored clothes. And Adelia felt guilty because she seemed to be walking down a slippery slope. The lady made the shirt according to old standards, so it was a little tight. But Servan was still happy. He leaned towards his beloved and reminded her that he would always be by her side as long as she allowed it. Meanwhile, in the castle, two more broke the silence. Beliata suffered while sleeping. Perhaps this was the price for saving her life. Hal felt guilty and sinful for what was happening, because she was suffering greatly from her involvement in changing destiny. But she still knew that no one would take Abel from her, so she sat by her bed and kissed her hand. In a large but dark room, Halo's Sonya sat by his queen's bed and prayed for her to sleep deeply. She had finally stopped crying and was beautiful. Hal gently smoothed her hair. There was regret on his face, but he couldn't be alone with his sadness. There was someone else in the room. Servan approached Halos with a confident stride. He sat on the headboard of the bed and explained that this is called trauma. How can someone remain sane when they have seen their own parents die and have their life threatened from an early age? During the day, Belle is fine, but at night this happens often. It was impossible to control her breathing due to shock. In any case, she was destined to die because of Cal. Even if they are distant relatives, the same blood flows in their veins. Servan smiled. By this logic, Seligal fell because of him. One gets a kind of big jump. Aloes asked if the commander's memories and the emotions of his ancestors were returning. For example, Hal's ancestors were stupid. The blood spirits scream at him to let the queen go. But all these were wrong conversations. Hal stood up and noticed that the two of them were alone during this period. It had been a long time since there was more than one person at a time. The queen's advisor said that despite their different lives, they must help each other. And Hal has useful information for Servan. Van didn't have to guess what kind of story it would be. Judging by the confidence of the guest from Sonya, it would be about hell. Hal began his story by asking if Van knew that Adelia had fairy blood, to which the commander nodded affirmatively. Aloes was surprised, but still noted that, unlike them, Adele's fate was predetermined. Seven didn't understand what his interlocutor meant, because Ada is normal. She simply has a hereditary blood disease. Hal replied that she was already born with Ada's blood, and this fact plunged Servan into horror. It was really because of him. Then the queen's advisor decided to remind his interlocutor where they started together. At the beginning, there was a fairy, by the way. Hal doesn't remember when he started calling her that. It was probably knowledge from his ancestors. The ancients were pure as a leaf. They were absorbed in how their ego grew, starting to think about their own individuality, demonstrating their certain temperament. Then a conflict broke out. They did not share common values and began to fight. The fairy felt sorry for the people whose hands were in blood and came up with a trick. She decided to seal different human temperaments. But the focus of this seal was the human body. The fairies allowed several people to continue living as planned with one temperament. The power possessed by one man was omnipotent, and someone, with the help of strength, wanted to change the world order, and so a bloody war began again. The fairy was terrified. She gave them power so that people could control themselves, but they were only indignant and blamed her. They didn't want to live. Then the pink-haired nymph offered them a reason to live if they agreed, and reached an agreement with her. The fairy imposed restrictions on the power of those who wanted to reach an agreement. People needed to find a person to imprint them, then it would be possible to use the power. Those who followed the restrictions received the most dangerous temperament in their body, and also followed this agreement. The fairy was immortal. Everyone was sure of their safety, and peace remained for a long time until unexpected love arrived. The man the nymph was in love with was named Gerard. He loved her, but died earlier. Because he was only a man, the fairy no longer wanted to live in this world without him. She was so sad that she forgot the agreement, and then ended her life and her temperament on the verge of release. Only after her body decomposed and her spirit was reborn again did the fairy realize that he was a son of Gerard. And she herself. The boy was named Selmond, and his destiny would continue. This is half of destiny. Because his father abandoned him. Selmond is a descendant of a fairy, so he will not have the opportunity to have power or a seal. And he will also have to care for and protect people. And at the moment he is betrayed, the agreement will be terminated. Destiny will be doomed, but it is not clear what will happen to the temperament that the fairy protects. The boy asked his mother in a serious tone if it would be okay. She replied that when the oath was broken, she would wake up after a long sleep. And the fairy herself will take care of what happens next, and these words only left a haze on the pink-haired nymph. The fairy immediately fell into a deep sleep. And Selmond Gerard was the first ruler of Gerard to fulfill his promise to serve the royal family of earls. No one in the world was such a dangerous person as him, so the character the fairy gave him was luck. That's why the fairy is not like Kalos or Servan has an advantage. This really hurt Van. He was afraid it might be a spell. However, Hal explained that the amulets he had were part of the magic. They were stolen from the fairy's blood. Servan's gaze darkened. He already understood what he would do to whoever dared to do such a thing. Alo suggested it was the Carrion Earls or Stirlimp. The army commander's eyes filled with anger. He was convinced that the two of them had done it together. Hal was surprised by Servan's knowledge, so he decided to insist on the topic. And he asked Van if there was any sign. The Carrion then said that he had already lost something he loved 10 years ago, so it would be a good idea to get another one. Duke Klimt, a member of the Elcarian family on his mother's side, only intended to use Adele from the start. It seemed that was his goal, but he was already one step ahead. Servan felt humiliated, as if he had been hit on the back of the head. They were especially trying to get the rare stone from Sonia. They were looking for something big and full of power. Then Hall wondered why they needed such an object, and it turned out they needed it to obtain the Lord's magic. But they still wouldn't be able to use it. Servan asked if the fact that Kalos didn't give them the stone was really his gratitude. He placed his hand on his heart and confirmed the accuracy of this assumption. He asked Servan not to worry too much, as Belle was very influenced instead of him. Naturally, Adelia is more susceptible to the influence of filtering power. And now Servan is simply a sealed vessel that has remained by her side for a long time. On the other hand, Van will make this decision again and again in any case, when time goes back. And this moment returns. Kalos has the ability to instinctively read evil. He found out everything about Elcarian's plan because he read his blackened soul when he arrived in Sonia. The concept of where they got the knowledge of forbidden magic may have remained in the imperial family. That lived for many millennia. Servan, of course, was not a man who enjoyed war, but this war was quite tempting. So, the young men stood facing each other, while the dawn was already waking outside the window. Carlos Sonia bowed and indicated that he had fulfilled his promise. A promise must benefit those who helped the person who made it, and this gratitude must be recognized by the other person. Sir Van Acedian acknowledged Carlos' gift to Sonia. If gratitude is accepted, the flame of alliance is lit and extinguished. But it seems they miscalculated from the beginning, because after returning, Adelia is in the process of breaking with the past that decided her destiny. This means that Alcarian's attempts to save the magic stones and Halo's attempts to trick him initially did not matter. And since gratitude is not expressed, Hal, according to Servan, must remain the fairy's dog. Meanwhile, the sun had already risen over the castle. The lady of the house, the army commander, and their guests were sitting at a large laid table. And they spoke casually about dishes and products. Adelia told the queen that the Gerards can borrow the power of a mechanism called Prilla, which is why products are so varied out of season. After all, this is an invention that keeps ingredients fresh, and the lady is even ready to give it to her guest after returning. Belle was very happy, because not everyone can use conservation magic. After eating, Hal and his sister asked to see the castle. They were very interested in the millennial history of this place. After they left, Adelia finally turned to Van. She smiled and invited him to go see that very thing. Then they ended up in a greenhouse where the rhyme seedlings grew. They exuded warmth and a pleasant aroma. But Adelia wanted to show him something else, so she took Van inside the greenhouse. The knight was amazed. Snow-white flowers shone in the sun before him. Adelia remembered that, when Van left, she shed many tears upon seeing these flowers. Because he planted them for her. After admiring the white petals, Ada grabbed Servan's hand and led him further. She couldn't wait to show her lover her return gift. Van was even more astonished and then completely embarrassed and lowered his gaze. Beautiful pink lisianthus bloomed before him. Adelia was happy that her lover liked her gift, and Servan was speechless when he knelt before the flowers. She noticed that he liked this plant even when they were buying rhyme seedlings. Thoughts spun in Van's head that if she had rejected him from the beginning, he would have remained calm. He looked at the beautiful pink petals and prayed that Adelia would never leave him. Van picked up a flower and walked around enjoying its aroma, when a soldier on the street recognized the plant as lisianthus. Ada was surprised to learn the name of this unpopular flower, but one look from Servan was enough for the soldiers to run away. Adelia noticed that maybe the boys ran away simply because they wanted to stay warm. Servan looked at the camp and noticed how well everything was here, even though Gerard is far from the border. The tents looked like they had been built over the years, and as if Adelia knew that the war would start in winter. Van's memory returned to his conversation with Ada before the outbreak of hostilities. Then he sat down and considered that there was still a month left until the war, and Sir Van was surprised that it would start so soon. The lady herself pulled him out of his strange thoughts. The knight put aside strange thoughts and decided to become more interested in Prilla. And the new weapon. Adelia was happy to hear this question. She wanted to know Van's opinion. She pointed out that inventions would definitely help in the war. In the middle of winter, ingredients are very limited, and Prilla is of great use. And despite yesterday's commotion, the weapons are also quite safe. It is ideal for those who were expelled only because, having good physical abilities, they could not match Wang. Adelia stopped and silently looked at Servan. Then she lowered her gaze and said that she would not allow the Gerard people to participate in the war. Van convinced her that as long as the ancient magic existed, the castle would be safe. But Adele, unfortunately, remembered that it had already collapsed once. The castle was burned down by earls, and Adelia feels guilty because she insisted on accepting freedom and the separation of the Gerards instead of Servan's army. Regrets for the stupid things done in the past made the girl more determined not to do them in the present. Adelia apologized for getting lost in thought, and Van replied that he was always willing to listen. And when it wasn't about going to war or leaving the castle. The lady sighed languidly and remembered that she was a prisoner of war, so it was unlikely she could go out alone. So, Adelia clearly hinted to Van that she needed his help, but he pretended not to understand anything, and offered to return to the castle, by which time it was already getting dark. Servan walked silently to Adele's room. The door creaked open, and he saw his lady sleeping. Most likely, she was waiting for him from the battlefield. But he was very late. Adelia even left a place for him in bed. He kept thinking about the lady's recent words when she said she was a prisoner of war, and she couldn't go out alone. Unfortunately, now Servan didn't have the strength to solve this problem. He was very tired, and he wanted to go to bed as soon as possible. But tomorrow he is determined to talk to Adelia, but for now, he lies down in the remaining spot next to the princess. The fireplace was burning in the room. The lady's bed was soft and warm. A beautiful voice whispered something nearby. Adele woke up and stroked the young man's face, but she couldn't understand if she had woken up. Maybe he is just pretending to be asleep, or you have to kiss him to wake him up. The kiss worked as expected. A blush appeared on Servan's face, and his eyes opened. The lady asked Van not to come so late, because she was worried. On the other hand, the main thing is that he wasn't hurt, and everything ended well. But after the exchange of sweet words, Adelia looked seriously at the knight, and asked him if she should side with Earless. Servan was so surprised by this question that he was speechless. Then he abruptly got out of bed, and shouted that it was difficult for him to understand the lady, even if she was joking. The commander was beside himself over the absurdity of this assumption and choked on questions. But even though he was indignant, he didn't notice at all how Adelia was fainting. So he had to call a doctor. The doctor examined the girl and wondered about the body aches. Adelia still had a slight fever, so she would need to take the prescribed medications. And she would get better soon if she rested. She needs to rest both physically and mentally. She must have been very tired lately. Servan stood in front of my lady and was very worried if he had taken care of her with enough care. He regretted his words, but if he had known what Earless was trying to do to her and her father, Adele would not have thought about it. Van looked at my lady's flushed face and knew that the carrion Earless would not let her live. The knight quietly approached the girl's bed, kissed her hot forehead, and asked her not to do anything dangerous. A few days later, a serious conversation took place again between the lovers. Adelia also wanted to participate in the war, because she is a woman and that is better than nothing. Therefore, she was going to the battlefield, preparing a plan in advance. But Servan was categorically against it. Adelia took the knight to her bed, put her arm around his shoulders, and tried to convince him again of the accuracy of her idea. Moreover, Servan insisted on calling her my lady, so the princess had to be reminded that it was better to call her by her name. The knight took her hand and tried to tell her that it would be better if she stayed here now. But Ada remained firm. She also wanted to protect Van and even asked him if he didn't think she was strong enough to do it. This, of course, was not true. And Adelia continued by saying that if her hands were stained with blood, hers would be too. What he does for her, Adele wants to do for him in return. Servan felt embarrassed, because when he thinks that a lady is getting involved in something dangerous, his blood freezes, he gets scared, runs out of breath, and doesn't like it. He really asked her to listen to him and protect him in some other way so that she wouldn't worry. Adelia kept arguing, insisting that she really wanted to cover Van's back, so that he can advance as he is doing now. This is her request. Adelia firmly took Van's hand and smiled widely, hoping he wouldn't resist her persuasion. He exhaled heavily and covered his face with his hand. He knew that everything would happen like this. Ada felt inspired by these words and decided that it was time to share her plan. And that is that Adelia would be a bad villain, and Servan in this story would be a poor victim. For the plan to work, you just need to play your roles exactly like this. Adelia will pretend to be a deceiver, betrayed Servan for the carrion, and will pretend to have run away. Servan will say that he was blackmailed and held captive. This situation will also arouse suspicion, but the carrion will not be able to get rid of her. The Gerards will definitely help her with money or with the famous name. Perhaps, deep down, Adele would be scared, but there was a possibility that her barracks were nearby. Van would have used tracking magic. No matter how strong the army is, if it loses its leader, it will fall immediately, in the blink of an eye. However, if this method is used, Adelia can leave her soldiers in enemy territory. Magic can be used to create a map, but it does not indicate where exactly the soldiers are going. Whatever Adelia remembers will be the most accurate information. Servan didn't understand why he needed knowledge of the factions, because the head of the family was the leader. And as long as he was in command, he couldn't stay off the battlefield. It is really impossible to get him out. He hasn't taken a single step forward so far. On the other hand, after the war began, Servan did not see Prince Earls at all. But if Adelia goes, she will definitely find him. Servan is not going to kill him, just because the real person is of great value to Adele. But all this is very dangerous, almost like falling and getting back out. Ada continued to convince her interlocutor that it was absolutely safe, because she even had a gold tablet. That was worth a lot of money and would reverse the magic tricks. But Servan had a better idea. He said he knew a more suitable person for this matter. Carlos Sonia can come to Adelia's aid. He meets all the criteria, and the carrion will need it. Even if the carrion doesn't allow him into the barracks, Hal could find out the prince's location. After all, Carlos, when leaving, warned that he would help in any matter, even if it was very difficult. Adelia began to have suspicions as to why Hal would help in any matter. Ivan also seems suspicious. It looks like they had some kind of deal, but this plan is really good. It only remains to convince Carlos, and for this, Adelia will be responsible for the queen's safety. Ada would even be happy to be Bella's babysitter. They got along well, so everything is fine. The golden autumn day was coming to an end. Adele was sitting in her office, reviewing documents when the butler entered. He said, as always, that it was urgent, but my lady didn't believe it. However, the butler sadly reported that the Rimla fields were destroyed. Adelia ran horrified to the greenhouse. The plants looked absolutely healthy. She asked Haley to turn on the light so she could look closer at the leaves. When suddenly, her vision began to cloud over. Ada staggered trying to get out, but couldn't stay on her feet and fainted.